In the estate of Marquis Hugo, a young lady, beautiful as Sleeping Beauty, slept. But after a wonderful sleep, she suddenly opened her luxurious eyes. Her family was taken aback when they heard a loud crash while sitting in the dining room. The young lady burst into the dining room like a whirlwind and asked everyone to listen to her carefully. She declared with a smile and a snowy expression that she was the best graduate and an excellent student of the magic faculty of the academy. She was also a pearl who received the title of Countess for her outstanding achievements, a candidate for the post of the next owner of the Magic Tower. She announced with a joyful smile that she was going to marry Lord Vandermeer. Her family froze in shock as they did not expect to hear anything like this from her. Ariscilia Hugo announced to everyone about her absurd marriage. At the same time, she was a brilliant sorceress, known throughout the world for her eccentricity. Several years ago, she announced that she was not going to get married, as she planned to dedicate her life to the Magic Tower. She said that they should come to terms with her decision because she wanted to remain alone forever. Madame, looking at her daughter with fury, said that it looked like she had done something wrong again. Ariscilia asked with a smile. What if she had already done a lot of things as soon as she woke up? The madam was furious and shouted at her daughter, but her sister asked why she suddenly decided to get married. Iris told her sister that it was very unexpected and worrying. She wanted to know if everything was okay. The young lady stood still for a moment, wondering what she should tell her family. She couldn't just say that it was all for her sister's sake, because she wanted to prevent her older sister's death. She had a secret that she couldn't even tell her family because she had prophetic dreams. She was taken aback when she saw her first dream in 5 years. In that dream, she saw her sister dying because of an arranged marriage. Ariscilia slowly descended into the dungeon to see her sister. Iris was surprised and did not understand how her sister ended up in such a place. Ariscilia Opashiv apologized to her sister for not being able to come earlier. Iris thanked her sister for coming at all. Ariscilia, bursting into bitter tears, asked her sister for forgiveness for not being able to protect her. Iris sighed and said that she was also to blame because she didn't know anything. Ariscilia was furious and shouted at her sister, saying that she was not guilty of anything and that only her husband was to blame. She was furious at the crazy young man. She did not understand how he dared to even think about treason. Ariscilia was furious and did not understand why her sister had to suffer so much because of him. Iris quietly said that if it weren't for the will, Lord Vandermeer would have inherited the duchy. Iris stated that she found out about this after the wedding, and her husband was fighting over the inheritance with his younger brother. She stated that the Lord was the captain of the Red Hawk Knights, but before she could finish speaking, she was suddenly attacked by a cough. Her sister was in shock. Iris sighed heavily and told her sister that she had a favor to ask. She wanted her to tell her relatives that she was very sorry. Iris, with a smile and tears in her eyes, asked her sister to take care of their family. A few days later, Iris was executed as the wife of a traitor, and the news spread throughout the capital. Everyone was shocked because she had committed treason. Ariscilia was furious because she understood that she was the one who should have gotten married. Now, in the present tense, she could not say that the reason for her marriage was a dream. Iris looked at her sister with bewilderment and worry as she did not hear an answer from her. But a moment later, she asked her sister if she had been secretly meeting with a young man. The young lady froze in place from shock because she didn't even know his full name and had never seen his face. Everyone looked at her in bewilderment because they did not understand why she wanted to marry him so much. The madam told the butler to call the doctor, but the young lady hastened to stop the butler. She looked at her mother intently and stated that there was already an agreement about the marriage with the duchy. Her parents were frozen in shock, unable to understand how she had learned such information. Ariscilia, with a joyful smile, declared that she would soon go to the Lord so she would marry him. As she left, she said goodbye to her parents with a joyful smile. All her relatives froze in shock, as they did not expect such a thing to happen in broad daylight. Meanwhile, the young lady was hurrying to her office, as she had already realized that her parents knew about this. Ariscilia understood that even she would find it difficult to talk about such a marriage of convenience. She froze in place for a moment as she still clearly remembered that dream. She remembered her sister's wedding when it was pouring with rain. Everyone watched this wedding closely. She remembered her sister's petrified face from her unwanted marriage. Ariscilia watched her fiancé with fury. She realized that he was using a marriage of convenience to decide who would be the heir, and he was using her sister in the fight for the inheritance. Ariscilia was furious and knew she couldn't allow this to happen, but she also knew she couldn't cancel the marriage. But she couldn't let her sister marry a man like that. So she wanted to marry her sister before her. Ariscilia knew that this way she could prevent her sister's death, but she understood that this was not enough. She couldn't forgive the family's sin that caused her sister's death, so she wanted to marry her younger brother. She understood that she would turn the tide of their battle for the inheritance. She wrote a letter to the Lord whose name she didn't even know. To be honest, she didn't really like him, but she intended to meet him soon. Meanwhile, the Lord was informed that he had received an urgent letter. The young man slowly approached and saw that he had received a letter from Ariscilia Hugo. She wrote that they would soon get married and therefore wanted to meet him, as she had an important conversation. She wrote that they should meet when they had free time, while the young man read the letter with bewilderment. The Lord was the second son of the duchy, captain of the royal guard, and also Ariscilia's future fiancé. In a hurry, he threw the letter into the fireplace as he realized that there were no adequate people among the magicians. He had no desire to have anything to do with her, and after reading the letter, he immediately vowed to avoid her company. The young lady had no intention of giving up without a fight. After some time, she greeted the Lord with a joyful smile. After greeting him, she asked him with a joyful smile whether he had hurt his hand. She said that he did not answer the letter, and therefore she thought that he was wounded. Damen immediately realized that in front of him was simply an abnormal woman. She was furious and wondered how he dared to tear up her letter, given that the young man's vow only lasted a few days. A few minutes before the captain's appearance, there was a commotion on the training ground. The vice captain asked the soldiers with bewilderment what they were doing during training. They were taken aback and reported that the young lady had come to the Lord. He looked at them in bewilderment as he did not understand what they were talking about. Ariscilia greeted the vice captain with a joyful smile as he arrived just in time. She looked at him intently and stated that she had come to such a place to meet the Lord. Everyone froze as they were captivated by her beauty, and the vice captain asked who she was. Ariscilia introduced herself with a joyful smile and also stated that she was the most famous Max of the Empire. At that moment, their faces became distorted and the smiles disappeared. They had heard of the young lady and thought she was just an eccentric from the magic tower. They understood that it would be impudent of her to show up in such a place. This was not surprising, and at the same time, they wondered what kind of ill-mannered girl had shown up without warning. The vice captain apologized and stated that she was disturbing the training, so he asked her to leave. Ariscilia stated that the Lord left his subordinates and was resting himself. She said with a smirk that their boss was a real lazybones. After all, the captain was furious. He asked her to refrain from disrespectful words towards their captain. She said with a smile that there was nothing wrong with it, that such words hurt him. She said with a grin that compared to the fact that their boss made her drag herself to such a place, it was nothing. At that very moment, the Lord came up to them and asked about the reason for the noise. The soldiers quickly greeted their commander. The Lord looked closely at everyone present as he wanted to hear an answer. The young lady, in turn, immediately greeted the Lord with a joyful smile and introduced herself. She asked him if he had hurt his hand because he had not answered her letter. At the same moment, he greeted his companion and also stated that he was not wounded. Ariscilia stated with restrained rage that he had nevertheless ignored her letter. Damen didn't answer her, but only looked at her menacingly. At that very moment, he called the vice captain. The Lord stated that since they were late for training, they should run around the court again. The vice captain accepted his punishment and asked for forgiveness. Damen immediately asked the young lady to come to his office. The doomed couple met for the first time, and inside their true feelings were heating up to the limit. But at the same time, the young people walked into the office without talking. At the same time, the young man was furious at the behavior of his companion, but he did not answer her. Moments later, he apologized for not responding to her letter, as he had been busy and had completely forgotten about it. She said with a smile that this happens if you have a bad memory. He said that if she came for this, she should leave. Damen stated that he was not going to marry her, and Ari asked if he knew that there was already an agreement between their families about the marriage. He said he'd never heard of such a thing. She said she'd only just found out about it herself, and either way, because of this arrangement, they'd have to get married. Damen was shocked by this and immediately shouted that he refused. She sighed and said that it was not something that could be brushed aside so easily. Ari looked at him with fury and asked why he refused at all. She shouted loudly enough to single-handedly deal with the large demonic beasts in the south last year and gain merit. Plus, she is a stunning beauty, and because of her outstanding achievements, she was a candidate for the post of the owner of the magic tower. He froze for a moment but did not answer her. At that very moment, she asked him if he wanted to overthrow his older brother and take the ducal title. He was taken aback, as he did not know how she knew such a thing. Ari said with a smile that she could help him with this. At that moment, he looked at her with fury, as he realized that it was she. Ari looked at him with bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He said with fury that she was the poppy who shamelessly appropriated the merits of their order during last year's purge of monsters in the south. The young lady froze in place as she did not understand what was being discussed at all. She couldn't stand it and shouted that she had saved his life when he almost died, and now he was calling her a parasite. Damen stated that she was simply biding her time to take advantage. She was furious because he was making unfair accusations. She could not bear it, and at that very moment released her power and declared that he was a knight and did not know what gratitude was. He asked with a sly grin what she was talking about gratitude when she couldn't even control her emotions. The marriage proposal almost turned into a challenge to a duel. At that very moment, a maid flew into their office and asked my lady to calm down. The maid looked intently at her mistress and hastily shouted that she had promised not to beat people anymore. Aries screamed that she needed to teach a lesson to the insolent knight who didn't even acknowledge his savior. Audrey screamed that she could do it later. The knight told the maid not to meddle in her mistress's affairs. Aries was shocked. She shouted at her companion not to meddle where he shouldn't. As she left, she shouted angrily that he would regret the concrete. He sighed and said that she herself should stop meddling in other people's affairs. He stated that he didn't need her help at all. Aries shouted that this was not true, and he would need her soon. She stated that his place as heir depended on this marriage of convenience. At that moment, the young man froze in shock. She screamed that his grandfather had left a will which stated that the ducal title and fortune would be inherited by his grandson, who would marry the granddaughter of the Marquis Hugo. The young man was shocked and shouted that she was simply talking nonsense. She shouted that it was promised before the emperor so he could check everything himself. As she left, she stated that the choice was his. The young man stood frozen in a daze and did not stop his companion. He was shocked that his grandfather had left such a will, but he was more puzzled by the fact that he really should marry a crazy woman. Damen sighed heavily as he knew he needed to study everything thoroughly and find out. Meanwhile, the young lady was filled with anger but continued to control herself. Aries had previously succeeded in a large-scale provocation disguised as a marriage proposal. She was furious because she understood that if it weren't for her maid, she would have definitely shown him where the crayfish spend the winter. Aries returned home with her heart still full of anger. But at that very moment, she met her sister and with a smile asked what made her come out and meet her. Iris looked at her sister with a smile but was unable to answer. Adrian looked at his sister with tears in his eyes and called her. Aries couldn't help but laugh out loud as she saw that her brother was just a little freak. Iris smiled and told her sister to calm down and stop teasing their little brother. Aries asked her brother with a smile why he was crying so much. He said that he heard that she was getting married. Bursting into tears, he said that after the wedding she would leave home, so he didn't like it. He asked if she could not get married. She said with a smile that she could not. At that moment, she turned her gaze to her sister and said that she was speaking seriously and that she was not at all teasing her younger brother. She told her brother with a smile that even if she got married, it didn't mean she would leave them and go away. Aries looked at her brother tenderly and declared that she would always be his sister. Iris smiled and said that their sister was right, because they were Hugo's trio until the end of their days. She said with a smile that even if her last name changed due to marriage, her roots would still remain with them. Adrian looked at his sister with a gentle smile, as he was glad to hear something like that. But he still didn't like the idea. And he didn't want her to get married. With tears in his eyes, he screamed that he also hated the Lord. She said that he had not yet seen him but already hated him. She said with a smile that if not him, then she would have to marry some younger guy. Iris asked her sister in bewilderment if she was really doing this because of a marriage of convenience. Aries said that was not true. Iris looked at her sister closely as she wanted to hear the truthful answer. She told her sister that she had always had a dream of becoming the mistress of a magic tower. She asked her sister not to involve herself in a marriage of convenience. Iris looked at her sister with a gentle smile and said that she always had an older sister. She didn't need to worry about such things. Aries was taken aback for a moment and stood frozen in place in a daze as she remembered her sister's face dying before her eyes. She froze at the terrible memory. At that very moment, she said that she wanted to marry the Lord not for a marriage of convenience. Iris looked at her in bewilderment as she did not understand the real reason. Aries, looking away from her family, stated that she liked him as a person. Iris stated that this was a lie and that it was not easy to fall in love with people. Ariscilia sighed heavily and said that it was true, because in fact she liked his face. She sighed as she realized she had said something that was completely unlike her. Her family froze in shock as they realized that this was not like her at all. Aries didn't understand that with Togo she had everything, and therefore she could choose a husband only by appearance. Iris was shocked and yelled at her sister that she had previously said that her face was the best, and that was why she wasn't interested in other guys. The young lady said that this time it was an exception, and in fact she was marrying the Lord for love. Iris was puzzled. because earlier her sister said that she didn't even know his face and name. Ari wanted her own look, because she understood that she was trapped. At that very moment, she shouted that the Lord had to send her a letter, so she had to hurry. Adrian looked at his sister in bewilderment and asked if their sister was really getting married. Iris sighed as if she didn't know what to answer. The young lady knew she had done all she could, and now she hoped that the Lord would hurry and agree to the wedding. She was furious and wanted him to answer her quickly. However, the young man did not respond again for a whole week. A week has passed since the young lord ignored the letter. At the same time, he was puzzled, because he understood that the sorceress had told the truth. Damen was shocked and did not understand what his grandfather was thinking when he left such a will. He understood that the family was already trying with all their might to erase him, and everyone in the ducal family, except him, knew about this will. And it was all for the sake of giving everything to his worthless half-brother, Oscar. He was puzzled because he knew he had to stop this. At the same time, he remembered their recent conversation. After all, the young sorceress recently announced that he wants to overthrow his older brother and take the ducal title. He was shocked and didn't understand how she knew such a thing. He understood that this marriage was not just a marriage, but an imperial decree, an order that no one in the empire would dare to disobey. In other words, if he marries the sorceress, the entire duchy will be his. He sighed heavily and called the young girl's magical teeth by name. Now he realized that she was not as crazy as he had previously thought. After some time, the young maid informed her mistress that she had received a letter from the Lord. She looked at her mistress with a smile as she was embarrassed after hearing about the letter, and memories of her mistress's childhood came flooding back to her. But at that very moment, she looked at her mistress with bewilderment as she saw that she was upset about something. Ari screamed and cursed the young lord with rage. The maid was puzzled. She did not understand what had happened. She hastily folded the letter, which the mistress had torn to shreds. The Lord wrote to the young lady that he wanted to meet her in the coffee shop at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, as they were to discuss their previous conversation. Ari was furious because he was simply stating the time and place of the meeting. She didn't understand if he had any shame because he was a whole week late with his answer. The maid asked her mistress to calm down. Ari was furious as he irritated her even more. She was furious because he signed his order, their last name, as if it mattered to anyone that he was from the Knights of the Red Hawk. The maid said that most people use the last name, but he was unique. Ari shouted that it was not uniqueness, but his inflated ego. She was furious and shouted that he was just an insolent young lord. She wanted to write him a letter and see who would win. At that very moment, she wrote a letter and asked her maid to send the letter to the Lord. Audrey took the letter and started reading. But at the same moment, she was taken aback, because she thought that they were just being childish. After all, her mistress suggested that the Lord meet at 5 in the evening. But in turn, the young man had a different opinion about the meeting and insisted that they needed to meet at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. After writing the letter, the young lady said goodbye to her maid with a smile. But in turn, she was very angry at the young man. Meanwhile, he stared into the distance as he understood that his companion was simply a crazy sorceress. They both knew they would soon get what they wanted. But they also knew that after everything worked out the way they wanted, they would quickly get divorced. And so the night thickened for the engaged couple, who had just agreed on their first date. Sometime later, the young lady conducted an experiment in the magic tower. Looking at the beautiful stones, she sighed heavily and said that she wished they would float a little higher. Sally thought for a moment and said that lifting the stone without magic was indeed not easy. Rudy said that he would try to find a way to reduce the weight of the floating stone. Ariscilia said with a smile that they needed him to retain his magic longer, so they should continue changing the concept of base minerals. Sally said with a smile that they would continue their research. Ari was happy about this, but she also noted that they were now doing everything themselves quite well. A moment later, she announced that it was time for her to go and asked them to make a report by tomorrow morning. She stated that she had an appointment, but also said with a smile that they had done a good job. The young people were surprised as they knew that their mentor had not left work so early for a long time. Sally thought for a moment as the young lady was in a hurry and was trying not to be late for the meeting. At that very moment, Ari shouted to the coachman to hurry up, while Audrey shouted about his mistress, who had reminded her earlier about the meeting. Ariscilia asked for forgiveness, as she had a lot to do, and at the same moment she shouted that they needed to hurry. After some time, they somehow reached their destination. The young lady was very happy and full of energy, as she knew it was time for her to settle everything, but the maid stopped her. Audrey was puzzled by her mistress's appearance. Ari said with a smile that she was still good for him and it didn't matter what she looked like. But her maid had a different opinion and shouted at her mistress to comb her hair without delay. A moment later, the young lady, with a radiant smile, asked her maid to remain outside, as she intended to go in alone. Audrey was shocked and asked her mistress to wait for her. But unfortunately, it was all in vain, as the young lady intended to quickly resolve this issue alone with her future groom. Audrey was shocked, because she understood that her mistress could do bad things. She wanted everything to be resolved peacefully, without bloodshed. The young lady, in turn, without wasting a minute, gracefully entered the cafe. She greeted the Lord with a smile. He, putting down his cup, said that she was late. Namely, she arrived 3 minutes late. She was in shock and shouted that he shouldn't be so petty. But at that very moment, she wondered if he really wore a knight's uniform even outside of work hours. She thought, still wearing the clothes of the magic tower. Damen looked at his companion with a puzzled expression and asked what she was staring at. In a similarly cold tone, he said that she should have ordered something already. A moment later, the waitress brought them their order and wished them bon appétit. After the waitress left them, an awkward atmosphere arose between them. Audrey looked closely at her companion and reported that he had previously said that he did not need her. She asked if he had changed his mind. Damen looked at her with bewilderment, as he had no words to answer her. But a moment later, he sighed heavily and said that he admitted that he needed her. She looked at him in bewilderment, as it turned out to be easier than she thought. Damen said with a smile that they could come to an agreement. At that moment, he looked at her intently and asked what she would say about their marriage. She said she wanted several things. Firstly, that her sister would not marry Vandermeer. He looked at her carefully but did not answer. And she also added that she would like them to get divorced sooner. Damen stated that he completely agreed with her, since he also had no desire to start a family. At that very moment, he offered to discuss the terms with her. Damen said he doesn't want any children during the marriage, nor any unnecessary physical contact, but they should actively support each other in public. He also wanted them to keep their secrets to themselves and get divorced immediately as soon as he inherited the title. She said with a smile that everything suited her. At that very moment, she said that they should certify the marriage contract in the temple. He teaches him, agreed with her, while the maid did not hear what they were talking about, but the atmosphere seemed good. Audrey said that now they need to plan the next steps, and she also said that she has already told her family about the wedding. Damen stated that they needed to keep this a secret from his family until the last. She was surprised and did not understand why. Damen sighed heavily and said sadly that his family supported his brother as the next duke. He understood that as soon as they found out, they would definitely try to stop him. Audrey was surprised that his brother had such a strong influence. Damen stated that his brother was the son of the current duchess, and his late mother was the previous duchess. Audrey sighed heavily as everything was complicated. She smiled and said that they needed to think with their heads instead. He asked, puzzled, what she meant. Arya smiled and said that the crown prince would soon be hosting a royal ball, and all the young nobles of high society will gather there. She said that this is where they will announce their wedding. The young man froze in shock, as he had not expected such a thing. She said that he was slow in thinking, because they had to announce the wedding at the royal ball. He was shocked and shouted that they would simply ruin the crown prince's events. She said with a smile that he didn't need to worry about anything, as the crown prince was one of her few friends. After a moment, they finally came to an agreement. Ariscilia said with a smile that they would figure everything out step by step. She looked at him with a smile as she was counting on his assistance. The young man, in turn, looked intently at his companion but did not answer. At that very moment, he said that she had forgotten about the conditions, and they should not have any unnecessary physical contact. He noticed that she had a weak memory. She was very angry because she had told him the same thing earlier. Meanwhile, the maid looked into the distance with her joyful smile. She was interested in how my lady was enjoying herself on her date, but a moment later, the young man opened the door menacingly and left the establishment with a tired face. Audrey was puzzled and did not understand why the young man left the establishment alone. Meanwhile, she was taken aback and froze in shock as she saw the face of her mistress. Audrey looked after him with fury because she knew that they would still see who would win. The young maid was shocked and did not understand what had happened. At that very moment, the young lady announced to her maid that it was time for them to go and get a dress for the royal ball. Audrey was delighted because her mistress was about to put on a dress. The coachman, looking at the young lady, asked with a smile where they were going. Audrey coldly replied that she would drive the carriage and they should just get inside. The man looked at her with bewilderment as he was puzzled. But before he could answer, Audrey assured the man with a smile that everything was fine and he should get inside. A moment later, the young lady pulled on the reins and at the same moment ordered the horse to hurry. The carriage shook instantly and the passengers inside stirred. With the upcoming wedding announcement, the young lady rushed at full speed to the royal ball. She was beside herself with anger because she knew that she would certainly take revenge on her offender. The young lady looked at her sister in bewilderment as she called her. Iris asked her sister in surprise if she was really going to announce her engagement at the ball, and Aries said with a smile that she was. She wanted the newspapers to be full of news of her marriage. Iris was puzzled that her sister wanted to announce her engagement at the Crown Prince's feast. She assumed that the prince would be against it. Aries said with a smile that Frederick said that he was absolutely not against it. She said with a smile that he was, after all, her best friend. Frederick, the second prince of the empire, is a close friend of Aries since their academy days. A formidable warrior, noble by nature, and a gifted orator, Frederick was considered a strong contender for the throne, surpassing his older brother. A moment later, she looked at her maid in bewilderment as she muttered something quietly. Audrey sighed and said that she was more concerned about the Lord's popularity than anything else. Aries was shocked. Iris declared that he was the dream of all noblewomen, and at the same time she noticed that he was very handsome, and her sister was right. Iris reported that at a young age, the young man went abroad alone and returned as the youngest ballmaster in history. They called him a beast, but they still admired him. So the fact of marrying him made her an enemy of high society. Iris looked at her sister with confusion, because she made a face like that when she wasn't interested in something. However, she could not resist and shouted to her sister to do without incident, except for the announcement of the engagement. Ariscilia agreed with her sister with a joyful smile. The moment Iris heard her sister's confident answer, she felt in her gut that her sister would cause a big commotion at the celebration. But she understood that her sister would definitely not listen to her. Sometime later, a wonderful ball took place in the imperial palace. A moment later, everyone was announced about the new guests. Ariscilia looked around as she saw a large crowd of people. She understood that the palace ball was on a completely different level. At that moment, she was taken aback as she heard the whispers of the ladies, who were surprised to hear that the sisters had come together, which was unusual. They said that the young sorceress never appeared in public. Ariscilia understood that gossip had already begun. The young noblewomen assumed that the lady from Hugo's family was monopolizing all the invitations to dance. Ariscilia listened to their gossip, clenching her fist in anger. But in turn, she was pleased, since this is what she needed. She wanted them to keep talking about her and spread her story far and wide. Iris looked closely at her sister and asked her to be more attentive. At that very moment, the young lady was taken aback, as she saw a familiar silhouette in the distance. She saw her companion, who, shining with beauty, entered the hall. She saw that he was beautifully dressed, and at the same time all the women's eyes were directed towards him. The young lady looked at the young lord with admiration and embarrassment. They said that he was the living sculpture. But the young man, without wasting a minute, gracefully approached his companion and greeted her. She greeted him back with a smile. Many years ago, on the day of the entrance ceremony to the academy, a young boy leisurely wandered through the nooks and crannies of the academy. He was puzzled because he understood that if he did not find a way out, he would be late for the ceremony. A moment later, he noticed a young lady ahead and, after apologizing, asked if she knew which building the ceremony was taking place in. Without a moment's delay, the young lady pointed out the direction to the young man. He froze and stared intently at the stranger. At the same time, the young man was very embarrassed because he saw that she was beautiful, and Frederick then fell in love with her at first sight. That same evening, her lady announced to the entire hall with a joyful smile that she was getting married to Sir Damen, and that she would soon send out all the invitations. Meanwhile, the prince froze in place in surprise. Frederick still suffered from the tragic pain of unrequited love. Without wasting a minute, he asked his girlfriend to explain in more detail what she meant by marriage. The young people looked at him in bewilderment as they did not understand what he needed to explain. He was shocked and shouted that she never mentioned the wedding to him. At that moment, everyone present was taken aback and bowed their heads to greet the crown prince. He froze in place as he saw that everyone had turned their attention to him. He was taken aback and completely forgot that so many eyes were watching them. Frederick realized that he had shouted loudly and that it had caused a commotion. Aries looked at her friend in bewilderment and called him. At that moment, she asked with a smile if they could talk in another place. Frederick looked at his friend with embarrassment, but he understood that they were in for a difficult conversation. After some time, the young people moved into the garden as they intended to talk in a secluded place. Aries noticed with a smile that he showed weakness. It was very unlike him, because he always insisted that he had to maintain the image of the ideal crown prince. He was taken aback and said that it was because she had suddenly announced her marriage. He did not understand how this was possible, since the young man was a knight and she was a magician. She smiled and said she knew that, but asked what it meant. He was shocked and said that she had previously said that she would never get married. Aries said with a smile that the young man had changed her mind. Frederick looked at his companion with embarrassment and timidly asked if she really didn't remember. After all, there was one promise they made in the library when they were freshmen. Frederick looked at his girlfriend with embarrassment and said that they both could remain unmarried until they were 40. He asked sheepishly if they could marry each other if that was how things went. He sighed heavily and said that it was too early to talk about their promise of marriage. She was shocked and did not understand how he remembered something like that, because they were very young then. He said that, then she said that they would get married. She was shocked and screamed that he was joking, and she was just supporting the game. Frederick was shocked because she suddenly announced her wedding without even hinting to him. He asked if she didn't realize how much he cared for her. Aries sighed heavily and said that she knew he cared about her as a friend. Sighing, she apologized for not telling him everything sooner. But at that very moment, she announced that this marriage was her conscious choice, which she came to after much thought, and therefore she wanted him to respect her choice. The young man was shocked by her statement and did not know what to answer her. He was devastated because he knew he had to respect her choice, but he still had his own feelings that he had for her. So when he left, he asked for forgiveness. The young lady, in turn, looked at him with bewilderment at how their conversation was a little different than she had expected. She was taken aback and wondered if this was a reason to be angry. Meanwhile, the young man watched the departing prince closely. He did not take his eyes off the prince, as he understood that the prince would soon interfere in their relationship. The day after the imperial ball ended with an unexpected turn of events, the newspapers wrote about the events of the century. Sometime later, the young man visited the estate of Marquis Hugo. Aries looked at her companion with a smile and asked him if he was ready. Damien sighed and said that he was not ready at all. He said, puzzled, that she had only told him about the day of the meeting with her parents yesterday evening. She said with a smile that they should do it earlier. Damien asked if there was anything he should look out for when meeting her family. She said with a smile that there was one moment, and she hoped that he was ready to take their beloved daughter with him. After some time, the young man was greeted by very menacing faces. Damien was taken aback and froze for a moment as it seemed to him that they were ready to eat him. The lady greeted the young man with a smile and thanked him for his visit. Damien bowed politely and stated that it was a great honor for him to meet them. At that very moment, Adrian shielded his sister with his frail body and declared that he was against this marriage. Trembling with fear, he shouted at the young man not to dare take his sister. Adrian shouted that his sister was too young to get married. He shouted that her choice fell on the youngest swordmaster, and he is the god of monster extermination. But still, this is not permissible. Damien looked intently at the young man and sighed heavily. A moment later, he walked up to the boy and leaned down. Damien declared to the young boy that he would marry the lady even if a knife were held to his throat. He glared at the boy and asked if he would still try to stop him. Adrian froze in shock as the pressure was unbearable and he was shaking with fear. At that very moment, he gave in to his emotions and was filled with confusion from the surging emotions. He quickly ran to his mother and burst into tears. The young lady looked at her companion in bewilderment. Damien said in confusion that she had previously said that he should take her away in any case. After some time, everyone gathered in the dining room. The Marquis looked intently at the young man and said that he would now ask him questions directly. He asked why the young knight had decided to marry their daughter. He said he had heard that it was not for political reasons. He sighed heavily and said that his daughter was unusual. The young knight, sighing, said that his companion was truly an outstanding person. He glanced sideways at his companion and declared that for this reason he liked her, and he realized that life with her would never be boring. Madame asked if this was the only reason for marriage. She was afraid that he might get tired of her daughter. Damien stated that this was something that he and the young lady would decide together. Madame was shocked and screamed that marriage was the most important decision in life. She looked closely at the young people and said that this meant that they should be ready to spend their whole lives together. She sighed heavily and said that that's why she wanted to ask them something. Looking at the young people, Madame firmly asked if they were really ready to spend their whole lives together. The young people froze for a moment at this question. At that very moment, the realization of this question came to them. And at that very moment, they made a sour expression, since none of them wanted anything like that. Madame looked at them with bewilderment and realized that they did not at all resemble the love doves. She shouted angrily that if this was not so, then they should not get married. Damien was taken aback and cried out that they would simply need time to comprehend the future, no matter how distant it seemed. Ari said with a smile that the truth is that they are getting married because it is the most important thing in their lives. Madame looked at them intently and said that she would like to tell them something, if that was so. She told the young man that he should not expect their daughter to become a typical wife, devoting herself to her husband, because she dreamed of becoming the head of a magic tower. She said that if he was going to ask the impossible of her daughter, perhaps it would be wiser to stop now. He sighed and said that he was not the one who needed the support of a wife. He declared that whatever the young lady might do after the wedding, he would not interfere in her affairs, as he intended to remain himself, and she herself. The madam asked in surprise if he would really not interfere with their daughter's work in the tower even after the wedding. Damen, looking at everyone present, declared that he had no right to do this, because it was solely her decision. These words sounded very loudly in the quiet hall, and it was they that made an impression on the family of the Marquises. After all, everyone knew perfectly well that the magicians from the tower were very conservative, but even they are not as stubborn as knights. After all, they exterminated everyone who encroached on their sacred knightly cause. And then one single phrase from the young knight turned out to be powerful enough to melt Hugo's heart. The young lady, in turn, was very happy, as she knew that the young man had impressed them. The Marquis burst into tears as he realized that they had indeed talked a lot, since he had previously thought that he was the only one who understood Ari. The young people, in turn, looked closely at their companions and declared that they did not need to worry about this wedding. At the same time, Adrian was steadfast, and, in turn, he was touched by the words of the newlyweds. At that very moment, silting up with tears, he asked if he could ask a question. Damen looked at the boy and asked what interested him so much. Adrian asked the knight how he was doing with Edgy. This is a feigned, exaggerated, childish behavior or reaction that imitates whims, disgust, or playful discontent. Damen looked at the boy with bewilderment, as he did not understand what they were talking about. He immediately declared that his sister had always said that she only liked men who knew how to be nice. Earlier, Ari said with a smile that if you are a man and there is not a drop of Edgy, then she is not interested in him. In fact, this was a lie on her part. Damen froze in place in shock, not knowing what to answer the boy. Adrian looked at the young knight with a gentle smile and asked him to be nice to his sister. He asked the knight to take care of her. Damen froze in place, stupefied, but his companion could not resist and burst into wild laughter. Thus ended the first meeting of the two families joyfully and warmly, thanks to Adrian's last word. The Marquis looked intently at the young man and called him. He said with a smile that there was something he had to tell him. Extending his hand, he asked the young man with a smile to take care of his daughter. After all, he always hoped that his daughter would be safe under his protection throughout her life. She would not realize her dream and would not do what she really wanted. But now he saw that there were no children who lived only by the will of their parents. He looked at the young knight with a smile and said that he hoped that he would keep his word given at dinner. He wanted the young man to allow his daughter to be free. Damen shook the Marquis's hand and assured him that he would do just that, and therefore he did not need to worry. The Marquis looked at the young man with a joyful smile and thanked him at that very moment. Ari looked at her companion with a smile and announced that she would walk him to the carriage. Adrian stared after his sister and shouted that she should come back quickly. She turned around and said with a smile that she understood everything and therefore asked them to go inside. For some time, the young people walked quietly towards the carriage. But at that very moment, the swordmaster stopped and quietly whispered to his companion that she seemed to have been very much loved in childhood. She looked at him in bewilderment, but said that it was not so. At that very moment, she declared with a smile that she was not only loved, but that she grew up surrounded by immeasurable love. He looked at her with a smile as he realized that this was the reason she had always been confident in herself. Looking away, her companion's response was met with the following. She said that this was not so because it was simply her character. Although, of course, when a person knows that she can rely on her family, her confidence increased. At that moment, the young lady asked why he asked such a question. He froze in place, not knowing what to answer. And at that very moment, his childhood flashed before his eyes, as the Duchess always hugged her son and praised him with a smile. Damen. At the same time, like an orphan, stood far from care. He had always been a stranger in his own home, and had never felt such warmth. Looking at his companion, he sighed heavily and said that he had simply asked her a question. But after a moment, his expression changed, and in his usual manner, he said that he wanted to know where she got such a peculiar nature from. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked if he had gone crazy. He left her question unanswered. A moment later, she said that they were about to be introduced to the ducal house. He sighed and said that the house had already learned of the engagement, and that there was a real commotion there. Damen, looking at his companion, said that his relatives would soon arrive in the capital, and, if he was lucky, this would happen the day after tomorrow. Ariscilia sighed heavily and declared that he should write to her before the appearance of his relatives. She also asked if there was anything else that needed to be prepared or to be careful. Without looking at his companion, he said that she simply needed to be prepared that she was getting that very eyesore, the youngest son of the ducal family. But a moment later, he said with a smile that he would write to her later. For some time, her young lady gazed intently after the departing carriage. She looked after him with bewilderment, as she was a little shocked by his words about him being an eyesore. But she understood that she should prepare for the meeting. Meanwhile, in the house, Madame was raging with rage. She was angry at the young lord. She didn't understand how he dared to encroach on her son's place, while she didn't feel sorry for anyone around her. And she continued to scream with fury that she would not forgive him for such a thing. The maids, trembling with fear, watched their mistress, who had destroyed the entire room. Madame angrily ordered the maids to prepare the carriage immediately. In a cold stupor, she declared that it was high time for her to look into the eyes of their youngest son. After some time, the long-awaited day arrived when her nalady was supposed to meet her fiancé's family. The butler looked intently at the young lady and asked her to come inside. After she entered the house, she was taken aback because she heard a scream. But the young lady was even more surprised when she ran into a girl on the steps. Nora White, with tears in her eyes and fury, asked Ari if she really intended to push her away. Ari looked at the young lady in bewilderment, as she did not understand what was going on at all. At that very moment, she stated that the lady was not visible at all from her field of vision. Nora was shocked by this. She declared with fury that she simply could not leave Lady Hugo. Nora said that the lady was always taking away men she really liked, and now she was making fun of her. Ariscilia looked at the girl with bewilderment and said that she didn't even know who she was. At that very moment, the young lord called Lady White. He looked at her with bewilderment and asked what else she was doing at the estate. The young lady called out to the young knight with tears in her eyes and embarrassment. Ari sighed heavily as she remembered something. The Marquis of White was the man who had once competed with their house for the mine and lost. So it was no wonder their house hated them so much. The young lady, with tears in her eyes, hurried to the young lord, but he declared that if she came closer, he would take legal action, namely, sue her. She was shocked and screamed that it was very cruel of him. She screamed that he knew how much she loved him. He picked me up and asked if she was talking about those moments when she was stalking him. As he was leaving, he asked his butler to see the lady out. She was shocked and screamed at him. Damen, in turn, did not pay any attention to her and asked his companion to go with him. Nora was furious and shouted at the young lady that she would regret her actions. Ari looked at the lady with a smile and asked her to enjoy her beauty. Nora was shocked by this, and at the same time she screamed that she would take revenge on her. Ari, in turn, asked with bewilderment how the young lady had ended up in such a place. Her companion stated that she had simply shown up uninvited, as always. The lady was puzzled that on the day of their meeting she found herself in such a picture, but it was still good that the girl had made such a scene before his family arrived. He sighed heavily and, puzzled, said that this was not so, because his relatives were already at the estate. Ari was taken aback and asked in surprise if they had really seen everything. He sighed heavily and said with bewilderment that he had barely avoided a scandal. At that moment, the young lady hurried and told her companion that he also needed to hurry, as she wanted to explain everything to the relatives. Damen, looking at his companion, declared that people from the ducal house would do anything to disrupt this marriage. He sighed and said that they were doing everything they could to ensure that he didn't get anything from his family. Damen looked pitifully at the young lady and sadly asked if she was sure she was ready for the meeting. She looked at him puzzled and asked what she should do now if she had already been to their house. She asked if he really wanted her to cancel everything. He was shocked and shouted that it was not so. She assured him with a smile that he did not need to worry, and it would be better for him to worry about himself. She said with a smile that she also did not intend to stand on ceremony in the choice of means, so he should prepare himself and cope with her. A moment later, the young lady burst into the room with a joyful smile and greeted everyone present. Ariscilia thanked everyone with a joyful smile for the invitation, as it was a great honor for her to meet her future husband's relatives. After her words, there was dead silence. The Duke turned around a moment later and asked if she was really going to marry his son. The young lady answered firmly with a smile that it was so, while the man frowned and looked at her. Sophie sighed heavily and told the lady that she had always adhered to the principles of independence. She wanted to know what had awakened her to marriage. Sophie said with a grin that she really hoped that the Marquise's daughter did not pursue any base goals. She stated that there were too many fortune hunters hanging around their sons, so they wanted to know her true motives. Damen was furious that his companion was insulted, but Ari smiled and said that she understood their concerns, but they didn't need to worry. She declared that she was marrying the young man solely because of his face, because he was handsome and there were few people like him in the area. She said with a smile that for this reason she decided not to miss such a chance. While Madame froze in place from shock, Sophie yelled at the young lady that marriage was no joke and she should be more careful. Aries stated that she was more careful now than ever. She said with a smile that wealth, beauty, talent, title, she has it all. But above all, it is her appearance. She stated that she did not need an impressive component, only a beautiful, ideal face, because this is the highest value. The crazy and shocking generation of appearance demonstrated by Aria left everyone in the family in shock. Everyone present was simply stunned by her statement and could not respond. At that very moment, Madame shouted that she still did not like the lady as a match for their son. The young lady said sheepishly that if they resisted like that, she would feel very awkward. At the same moment, she changed her manner of speech as well as her facial expression, as this all turned her on. The couple were shocked and did not understand what was happening. At that very moment, the young lady said with a playful grin that this could be called her passion for beauty, because their son would be the first piece in her collection of beauty. Madame froze in place in shock, as she realized that she had underestimated the girl. Madame assumed that the girl was simply an eccentric, and she thought that, having hurt her pride, she could break off the engagement. But now she looked at the young lady with bewilderment, because she understood that she was just a real psychopath. Thus, the meeting of the families passed under the one-sided pressure of the young lady. The ducal couple was demoralized. Damien sighed as he stood by the carriage and said goodbye to the young lady. At that moment, she quickly turned around and looked him straight in the eyes with a satisfied smile. The young man froze for a moment, not expecting such closeness. She smiled and said that now all that was left for them to do was get married. He breathed a sigh of relief and said with a smile that it was so. As she left, she said goodbye to him, and he said goodbye to her in return and gave her a gentle smile. For a while, the young man stared intently at his girlfriend, but a moment later he was taken aback, as he heard a familiar voice. Madame looked at him intently and asked if he really thought that with such antics he could take away what belonged to his brother. She looked at him with fury and asked where he found such a wild girl. She shouted that he would make a laughingstock of their family, but the young man didn't answer. He just looked at her with a grin. She was furious that he was smirking in front of her and shouted at him to stop getting cocky. He didn't answer her, but she shouted after him that he was just a loser. He stated that hard work sooner or later turns a loser into a winner, especially if you take away what belongs to someone else, as the Duchess did. She looked after him with fury, but she realized that she could not answer anything. He sighed heavily and stated that he had to leave as he had business to attend to. Madame looked after him with fury and tirelessly repeated his name. She was very angry because she understood that he was very similar to his mother, but he kept his back to the end, pretending that he was proud of him and unattainable. Sometime later, a meeting took place between the Duke and the Marquis. The Duke presented the Marquise's family with enormous wealth and declared that if they refused the marriage, he would give them several times more. He stated that they were starting a business and could fulfill any of their wishes. The Duke inquired about their eldest son instead of the youngest. The Marquis looked at the man in bewilderment and declared that his daughter was more suited to their younger son than their elder one. The Duchess asked with a smile, "What about marrying their Oscar to their eldest daughter Iris?" The Duchess said with a smile that their youngest son had been very naughty since childhood, so they sent him to study abroad to calm his temper a little. She looked intently at the Marquis and asked if he was really sure of this choice. The Marquis sighed heavily and said that everything was fine. She stated that they wanted to do what their children wanted, so they would never give up on this marriage. The spouses glanced sideways at each other as they understood that they had to prevent this marriage by any means necessary. A moment later, the servant informed them that a letter had arrived from the imperial palace. Everyone present was taken aback, as they did not expect such a thing. The Marquise breathed a sigh of relief, as she was glad that the letter arrived when they were all assembled. She looked closely at her companions and stated that they knew that this was a dynastic marriage, and that it was also an order from the emperor. Therefore, she immediately reported this to the emperor. She wrote a letter to the emperor and stated that they would fulfill the late duke's will and the promise made to the emperor. The servant looked intently at everyone present and announced that a letter from the emperor had arrived for both their families. The duke stood frozen for a moment when the letter was presented to him. The Marquis looked at the duke with a satisfied smile and called him matchmaker. The couple stood frozen in shock and numbness. After some time, Madame asked her husband what they should do, because she knew that they would be stubborn, but she did not think that they would report everything to the emperor so quickly. She was worried that the young man could actually become the heir of their family, but the duke did not answer his wife. He himself was puzzled by this turn of fate. He remembered their last meeting with his son. Then the Duke looked menacingly at his son and asked if he had any words he would like to say in the end. Damien looked at his father with fury and anger. But a moment later, he declared that his father was a coward who hid behind women. After some thought, the Duke turned to his wife. He angrily informed her that tomorrow, when she met the young lady, she should really hurt her, and he would decide this matter himself. At the same time, there was a commotion in the magic tower, because the young people did not expect that their mentor would marry a knight. Ari smiled and said that it was true and that they had already met the parents and that they would get married in a month. The young people were shocked that everything was happening so quickly. Sally asked with bewilderment whether she would really leave the magic tower, since all the women retired after marriage. Ari smiled and said that she was not going to leave the magic tower because it was just a marriage, especially since she wanted to become the head of the tower. She looked at her comrades with a smile and asked them not to worry, but rather to concentrate on their research. The young people were happy with this turn of events. Moments later, they heard a knock on the door. The man entered the hall slowly, and everyone present hurried, as they did not expect to see the head of the magic tower. Ari was taken aback and asked in surprise how the teacher had come to visit them. The head of the magic tower looked at her with a smile and said that he learned that she was getting married. He was puzzled because he thought that she would tell him such important news personally, since he learned about everything from the newspapers. She smiled and apologized because it all happened too quickly, but he didn't even think of being offended by her. So he offered to have some tea. After some time, they were drinking tea, and the man said with a smile that he had previously thought she had gone crazy. But at that very moment, he declared that, given his age, he should have been the first to go crazy, and declared that he remembered that just yesterday she had brazenly burst into his laboratory. Then she declared that she was not going to get married, so he should give her the position of head of the magic tower. She smiled and stated that it was not a serious marriage, and they just had what they wanted from each other. And after achieving it, they would divorce. He asked what she wanted to get from the knight, and the man also said that she should remember the incident in the past when a poppy and a knight got married. Her expression changed, and she asked if he was talking about the Litterson case. Are cases where a swordmaster was killed by his mage wife? And cases where a magus intentionally befriended and killed a knight, which shocked society at the time. The man stated that people were saying that she was the reincarnation of that sorceress. The young lady was shocked and angry. She was furious because she did not understand who was saying such things, because in front of her they could not even say a word. He sighed heavily and said that he was very worried, because after this incident the situation of women could worsen and they were criticized even in the tower. At that moment his face changed and he said that he would like to ask whether what she could get from the knight was really worth the price of her future. The young lady froze for a moment, not prepared for such a question. But at that very moment, she saw her sister and brother in front of her. Without thinking, she said that this was more valuable than the future, so she had to get married no matter what. The man sighed heavily and said that if this was her decision, then he supported it. But at that very moment, he asked, they had already something happened to the prince. Harry looked at him in bewilderment. He stated that regular letters received at the tower had stopped. At that very moment, the young lady screamed as she had completely forgotten about Frederick's existence. After some time, she wrote a letter because she did not know why he was angry. But she stated that she had no friends, so she didn't want to quarrel with him before the wedding. She didn't understand what she was guilty of and suspected that he had simply become convinced without reason. At the same time, the young lady asked him for forgiveness and wrote that when his mood improved, he should write to her. The young man understood that the letter he had given her was in her spirit, but there was something he really did not understand. Frederick did not understand when his friend managed to secretly meet with the knight and decide on marriage. He knew that she did not do anything that was not beneficial to her. He knew it was very strange, but there was some reason why she did this. He ordered his knight to investigate the information about Damien from head to toe, and also ordered a separate person to be presented to the lady so that he would report on her actions. Putting the letter aside, he asked his girlfriend for forgiveness, as he understood that he would have to wait with the answer, since he could not understand her marriage. Meanwhile, the lady was anxiously asking her husband what they should do about this situation. He sighed heavily and told his wife that she would soon meet that young lady. For this reason, she must provoke her, and he will take care of the rest. The lady looked at her husband with a satisfied smile. She did not understand how he could be so irresistible. In turn, she quickly agreed with him and shouted that she would immediately bring her to justice. After some time, the young lord scolded Madame for her lateness and said that if she had invited someone, she should arrive on time. The lady looked at the young man with bewilderment, as she did not understand why he was present at their meeting. Ari said with a smile that it was she who invited him, and she also told Madame that she had not finished speaking. that she should come alone. Damien stated that he and his wife are busy people, so this is the last meeting before the wedding. Madame said that he was causing her mother's heart pain. He sighed and said that he was tired of being treated like a son only when it was convenient. The lady looked at the young man with fury, but said nothing. Ari looked at Madame with bewilderment and asked why she had called them. At that very moment, Madame called her maid and asked her to hand over the documents. The maid handed the documents to the young lady and asked her to read them. The lady, in turn, began reading the document. She was momentarily taken aback as she was presented with a list of the dowry, very expensive jewelry and clothes, an outrageously large sum of money, and even a luxurious new house in the capital. She froze in shock as she did not expect anything like this. She told the Duchess that the demands made on her were too high. She did not understand why she should provide a new home in the capital. The lady said that they were planning to move to the mansion where their son would live after marriage. This house originally belonged to their family, so the lady should pay appropriate compensation. The lady was shocked and said that they needed to find a compromise. Damien asked his companion for documents. The lady told her son with a smile that it didn't matter what he said, because they wouldn't compromise. At that very moment, the young man threw away the documents and said that she had to cut them in half. Sophie was furious and shouted that they would not compromise. He said that he would meet with the emperor. She looked at him in bewilderment. He said that if they insisted on such conditions, it would cause inconvenience to both families. Damien asked angrily what the wise solution would be. He said that the mediator could find the answer. She was shocked and trembling with fear, asking if he had really threatened her. The young man said that he would not dare to do such a thing, because he was only giving her a choice. The lady looked at the young man with fury. At that very moment, she said that after the wedding, the lady could move in with them at the ducal estate. Ari apologized and stated that she worked in a magic tower, so it was impossible. Madame was furious and shouted that after the wedding, she would have to leave the tower, and that this was natural for a woman. The lady said that she had no reason or desire to do such a thing. Sophie asked, who would then be the support of her husband? She didn't understand who would take care of the household chores. She screamed that if this continued, she would protest against the marriage again. Ari stated that she was not getting married to be a support for her husband. Madame was shocked and did not understand what the hell she was saying. She looked at her interlocutor with a grin and asked what kind of upbringing the Marquise had given her. Ari was furious because Madame had insulted her family. At that moment, she said with fury that her family had taught her not to clean up after other people's sons. Also, if one of the elders says something stupid, it is necessary to respond with facts. The lady was furious and asked the girl if she was really talking like that she was now talking nonsense. Ari said with a smirk that she never said the Duchess was talking nonsense, but since she interpreted it that way, it must be true. The lady was furious as she understood that the girl was simply making fun of her. Damien immediately declared that the young lady would live with him in the capital. Madame furiously shouted at him not to interfere in their conversation. He angrily asked when Anna had ever treated him like a member of the family. At that very moment, mocking his stepmother, he asked if she would really recognize him and the lady as part of the family. He said that if she was planning to train her as his successor, then she should stop. Madame was furious and could not answer anything. Ari asked the Duchess for forgiveness because if this was her husband's will, she could not disobey him. She said that the best support is to follow your spouse's wishes. The lady was furious, and yet she could not object to the young man. A moment later, the Lord rose and said goodbye to his stepmother, and also said that they would see each other at the wedding. Sophie shouted furiously at her so-called son that she had not finished yet. The young lady, in turn, also rose and said goodbye to the Duchess with a smile. A moment later, the young man put his arm around his companion and announced that he would walk her to the carriage. Ari looked at him in bewilderment, as he always did not touch women. Moments later, they were walking leisurely towards the exit. She looked at her companion in bewilderment and asked what else they needed to prepare. He sighed heavily and said that she should prepare half and he would take care of the other half. Ari was glad to hear that. He looked at her intently and declared that all they had to do was sign the contract and register the marriage. She said that they needed to do everything gradually since they were both busy. He said that in that case, they needed to hurry to the temple. At this, the young lady mockingly said that he was very busy waving his sword. After her words, she ran away from him at full speed while he was drilling her with his gaze. In her joy, she cried out that she would drop in to see him after work to discuss all the details of the contract. But at the same time, she stepped on her dress and slowly fell down the steps. The young lady was in shock. She understood that the fall was inevitable, and at that very moment, she closed her eyes. But a moment later, her newly made husband easily managed to catch her. She looked at the young man in surprise, as she had not expected anything like this at all. In turn, he froze in place as he realized what had happened. She thanked him with a joyful smile. But at that very moment, he let go of his hand and she fell with a crash. He shouted at her to be careful. Aerie looked at him with fury and indignation, as she did not expect this. Damen looked at her intently and said that they did not know what could happen before the wedding. And at the same time, some could arrange something to disrupt the wedding. At that moment, he sincerely said that she should be careful. In a hurry, the young man turned around and walked away, but at the same time ordered the butler to show the lady out. Aerie was shocked by everything that happened at that moment. She screamed and called her fiancé. She looked after him with bewilderment because she saw that he was somehow strange. Aerie was puzzled and didn't understand why he was so tense. A week before her daughter's wedding, Madame shouted at her to show at least a little effort, because even for her mistakes, people could gossip about her behind her back. But the young lady only screamed in rage that in that case she would bite their throats out. Aerie sighed and said that she had to go to work soon and that trying on the dress could be postponed until later. Her sister assured her that this should not be done, but she shouted that it was very tiring. Iris told her mother not to take her daughter's jokes seriously. Madame looked at her children with a sigh. Looking at her daughter, she said that now all that remained was to arrange her wedding. Iris smiled and said that she would gradually look into choosing a good candidate. Aerie said with a smile that if sister didn't get married, the situation would become very interesting. Iris sighed and told her sister to take her words back, as she could see that her mother was furious. The madam sighed and told her daughter that great responsibility and hopes fell upon her. The young lady sighed heavily and told her mother that she knew about it and there was no need to worry at all. Aerie yawned and asked her mother not to put pressure on her sister. She smiled and said that if things continued like this, their sister would simply suffocate from stress. The madam looked at her daughter with fury and shouted that she should try to be like her. The madam angrily attacked her daughter and shouted that she was not listening to what she was told. She shouted at her daughter that she had to try on the dress before work. Iris looked at her sister with a smile and asked her to hold on as best she could, because their mother was nagging. But in reality, she was happy. She said that if it were an arranged marriage, she would have to try on the dress. Aerie said that she could have endured an arranged marriage. Iris smiled and told her sister that she would not have allowed such a thing, because she did not want her sister to sacrifice for a political deal. Aerie asked her sister in bewilderment if she could really sacrifice herself. Iris said that she didn't mean it that way at all, because her sister had a dream and she knew about it. Aerie told her sister that she should also have a dream. Iris said with a smile that her dream was for her sister to get married successfully. Aerie looked at her sister closely and said that this was not only her dream, but also her mother's. She asked her sister to find what she wanted. Iris froze in shock for a moment, unable to respond to her sister. A moment later, the young lady noticed that it was already late. A moment later, she shouted that she was already in a hurry to get to work, but asked her sister not to say anything to their mother. The young lady stood there for a moment longer, looking intently after her sister. She was puzzled because she had never thought about her dream, and her sister's words made her think about a lot of things. After some time, the young lady smiled and said goodbye to her workmates, but she was very exhausted. As she left, she saw that her companions were on the edge, and at the same time, she knew that research had been at a standstill for several weeks. As she walked out of the tower, she froze for a moment as the man greeted her. Bowing, he said that he had been ordered to deliver her. She asked in bewilderment what he had ordered him to do. The man said with a grin that everything was according to Sir Vandermeer's instructions. She looked menacingly at the man, because she had already warned her companion that she would stop by home today and be late. As she walked towards the carriage, she asked where he had told her to take her. The man said that he had been instructed to bring her to the mansion. Now the young lady understood what her groom was afraid of. Previously, the young man said that anything could happen to her before the wedding. After all, there were those who were against their marriage, and they could have gone to any lengths to prevent their marriage. The young lady, in turn, calmly entered the carriage as she wanted to see what they had prepared for her. A moment later, they were driving down a quiet street. The coachman, in turn, gave a signal to his companions. At the same time, the mercenaries closely watched the moving carriage. They kept their eyes on the carriage, knowing that they would soon begin to act. After all, their target was a poppy from a noble aristocratic house. At the same time, the young lady was cool and calm in this situation. This was a task from one client. He wanted them to cause wounds so that the victim would be unable to move for a while. The man knew they just needed to break a couple of her limbs. At that moment, he threw all his thoughts away just as the young lady turned to him, and he was puzzled to ask what had happened. Aerie used her power and asked if a couple of broken limbs was normal. The man was unable to utter a word when suddenly a loud explosion thundered inside the carriage. His accomplices were shocked, as they did not expect anything like this. But after this explosion, he could only utter a few words in a trembling voice, and at the same time he warned his comrades to run. The man was trembling with fear, because he had been told earlier that their target was this fragile aristocrat. Now the mercenaries realized that they had messed with the wrong person, and they saw the aristocrat's terrible and furious gaze. She wanted them to come out of their hiding places immediately, and the men did not hesitate to target the aristocrat. Aerie immediately used her power for a minute, and at that very moment she pointed it at the man who was rushing headlong towards her, and in doing so he crashed into the wall of the house with a bang. The man was in shock, but at that very moment he screamed and signaled to others. In an immediate moment, his companions rushed towards the young lady. The mercenary raised his formidable wooden stick over his victim's head in anger to strike. But the young sorceress did not move from her place, and she only quietly said that all this irritated her. At that very moment, she unleashed her formidable power and smashed the weapons of her opponents to smithereens. The man froze in shock when he saw what had happened to his weapon of revenge. His partner stood frozen in a daze as they had failed to land a single blow on her. Aerie glared at her enemies and reported that the tower's mages received stars for their achievements. She stated that the head of the tower himself had 7 stars, but it was not easy for an ordinary magician to get even 1 star. But looking at her enemies, she said with a smirk that she had as many as 4 stars, so they should not expect an easy death. The men stood frozen in fear as she used her power to bind them. After some time, the young lady dragged her offenders to the mansion of her future husband. He looked at the men in bewilderment. His companion then informed him that his father had sent them as a gift. She looked intently at her companion and stated that they needed to talk calmly. Damen, in turn, stood frozen in place, and at the same time he was paler than on an ordinary day. The man sighed heavily and said that the Duke had indeed given them an order, and he had ordered that the lady be beaten so that she would be laid up for a while. They looked at the men in surprise and remained silent for a while. Damen, without wasting a minute, asked his companion for forgiveness, but he also asked if she was injured. She sighed heavily and said that she was not hurt at all, but asked why he was apologizing. Aerie said with a smile that it was not his doing. He was shocked and did not understand what she was saying. He said that he should have been more concerned about her well-being than anyone else. The young lady was shocked by his words and at the same time froze in embarrassment for a moment. A moment later, she said that in that case, he should take them away, because they were so frightening that she could not utter a word. At that very moment, the young man called his butler. For a while, the young ladies watched sideways as the men were led away to the dungeon. Damen, looking at his companion, said that he would like to clarify something. He sheepishly asked if the situation had really affected her so much that she wanted to call off the wedding. Aerie said with a smile that this whole situation only made her more excited, and the more difficult it is to pick a flower, the more desirable it becomes. He froze for a moment in shock, but then she said that she did not want her sister to enter into an unhappy marriage with the Duke's son. Damen stated that he agreed with her, but he had the impression that she was even more convinced of this than he was. He looked closely at his companion and stated that he had the feeling that she knew that her sister was headed for a sad end. The young lady, in turn, did not take her eyes off him and stated that perhaps that was the case. She smiled and said that her intuition told her that the Duke's son would not remain faithful to his wife. He completely agreed with her. She said that usually such people are prone to intrigue, so she was going to marry the unlucky knight. She said with a smile that she had no intention of backing down, so he could rest assured that it was all for the sake of her family. The young man was pleased with her words and therefore agreed with her with a smile. He stated that he would deal with the consequences of this incident and vowed that such a thing would not happen again. She was glad to hear this. After all, they were supposed to get married soon, and she didn't want any extra hassle. Aerie looked intently at the young man and stated that they would discuss the terms of the contract tomorrow. But at that very moment, she froze in place because she saw him in a different light. She was a little puzzled. And at the same time, she didn't know why he was looking at her so intently with a sad expression on his face. Damen sighed and told his companion that he just wanted to make sure she was safe. She smiled and said that she had a small bruise under her clothes, but he was powerless to do anything about it. But a moment later, he said that she should check everything herself and bill him for the treatment. She was shocked and screamed that this should not be done. The young lady ran away from him in a hurry, as she was irritated by his manner of speech. Damen Nemedlia called his deputy. At that very moment, he sternly told his deputy to use all his resources. After all, he wanted the deputy to find out everything about the mercenaries, since he intended to deal with them as quickly as possible. After some time, the young man visited his father's residence. The maid stopped him because he did not warn them about his visit. Damen had no intention of listening to them, and at that very moment he burst into his father's office. The Duke told his son that he was behaving strongly. Damien declared that he was like his father, who had sent such a wonderful gift to his daughter-in-law. The man looked at his son in bewilderment and asked what gift he was talking about. At that very moment, the young knight threw the document at his father and told him to choose. Damien angrily told his father that either he would sit quietly until the wedding, or he would deal with her son's cleverness by making up a story about robbers. Either he will play the role of the groom's faithful in order to report his father's atrocities for the sake of his beloved. The Duke was shocked and shouted that he had threatened his father. He was shocked because the mercenaries shouted that they would not surrender even if they lived, but they themselves wrote a sincere confession. The Duke stated that he would not be the only one to suffer. Damien knew that this was so. However, if the Emperor gets wind of this, the Duke will be in trouble. The Duke angrily attacked his son and began shouting obscene things at him. The young man stated that he did not intend to give up on the marriage, so his father had to make a decision. The Duke looked at his son with anger, but at the same time he declared that he was sad to know that his bride had been attacked by robbers. And no words could heal the pain caused by such a tragedy. Damien told his father that he didn't need to worry. He shouted that he had already prepared everything. And at that very moment, the young man presented a written agreement for his marriage and told his father that all he had to do was sign it. The Duke looked at his son with fury, but he knew he had no other choice. So the Duke gave his consent to his son's wedding, and after some time they came to the temple to sign the contract. The high priest asked the young people what they wished to certify, and the lady stated that they would like to certify the marriage contract. A moment later, the priest read all the clauses of the marriage contract. After reading it, he swore to the young people that all information would be kept in the strictest confidence. The newlyweds were very happy to hear this and happily thanked the priest. After everything that happened, Damien said with a smile that they were completely finished, so they would see each other tomorrow. The young lady in turn stopped her companion and, sighing, said that she would like to warn him. She quickly changed her expression and declared that he should not fall in love with her, despite all her charm. He looked at his companion with puzzlement and asked if she was aware that delusional reasoning could be regarded as a sign of deviation. Aries stated that her unearthly beauty would cause him a lot of trouble. She looked at him with a smile and said that she was completely serious, because unrequited love poisons the soul. He looked at her with a smile and said that she was acting too self-confident. As she left, she said with a smile that he could think whatever he wanted. She turned around, smiled, and said that they would see each other tomorrow at the ceremony. Damien sighed heavily and asked her to take care of herself. At the same time, the young man quietly watched the newlyweds. He was puzzled and did not understand why they were talking to the priest. He knew that they wanted to register their marriage in the temple, but at the same time, the young man understood that one should not meet with the priest responsible for the documents without a good reason. At the same time, the young man understood that he had unearthed something worthwhile. At that moment, he realized that they were connected by something more than just a simple marriage vow. He wanted to hurry and tell the crown prince everything. Sometime later, the young man visited the crown prince. Frederick was surprised and at the same time glad that his friend went to the priestess. He asked his knight if he had found out what they had assured. At that moment, the knight asked for forgiveness, since he had not found out anything more. Frederick sighed heavily as he expected more. At that moment, he looked menacingly at his subordinate and told him to wait for further instructions. But moments later, he said with a smile that his friend's wedding was tomorrow, so he wanted to talk to her privately. On the wedding day, the young ladies looked at the handsome young man with surprise and admiration. They were surprised and amazed by the groom's beauty. Ladies, only you fucking assumed that they could marry a wonderful man, while they were very envious of the young lady. But the young lady also said with a smile that she didn't even envy the girl. After all, now the young man's heart belonged to the young lady, despite the fact that everyone considered her an eccentric. She was truly a beauty. Meanwhile, the young lady sat quietly in the bridal room. She looked at her family with a smile and asked what they thought about her outfit. Her family happily said that she was beautiful and simply the best. The Marquis, with tears in his eyes, could not believe that his daughter was getting married. Madame calmed her husband so that he would not cry. They were worried about her, because they did not know how they would live without her, but they also sincerely congratulated her. Ari smiled and thanked her brother, who brought her flowers and congratulated her on the holiday. She looked at her sister and said that she didn't need to worry as she would be visiting them often. She also invited her sister to the tower. Iris said with a smile that she would definitely visit her, but moments later they heard a knock on the door. The prince came to them and greeted the bride with a smile. The couple bowed low and greeted the prince. He looked at the bride's relatives with a smile and said that he would like to talk to her alone and ask them to leave. The lady was shocked, as this was unnecessary, but he stated that he would like to talk to her for just a few minutes. Looking at his bride, he said that he just wanted to say goodbye to her as a friend. Ari looked at the prince intently and stated that he had not responded to her letter, and that was why she thought he would not come. He asked with a smile if she really wanted him not to come. She said that was not true, because he was her friend. He smiled and said that he couldn't miss his girlfriend's wedding, especially since it was important to him. He looked at his companion with a smile and said that he would like to make her a promise. He stated that he still regretted that she was getting married. Therefore, he was not going to break off relations with her because of the young knight. And no matter what happened, he would not let her go. At that very moment, he said with a smile that one day she would regret this marriage. The young lady was shocked by this, and she sternly said that she would not regret the marriage. Frederick said with a smile that when she finally regretted it, she could come to him, because even if she was stuck in mud up to her ears, he would gladly extend his hand to her. The young lady was shocked by his words, and at that moment she pushed his hand away and declared that she appreciated his loyalty. But her expression changed and she declared that he was now saying extremely unacceptable things, and she asked him if he understood this. He asked for forgiveness with a smile if he had offended her with such words. She shouted that only this time she would turn a blind eye to such things. As he left, he thanked her with a smile for this. But at the same time, the young lady was a little puzzled by their conversation. She didn't understand why he had been provoking conflict lately. Meanwhile, the young people were talking among themselves in bewilderment, since they really did not believe that the lady was marrying a knight. The knights whispered among themselves, as they could not imagine that the commander would seriously marry a magician. At the same time, Madame watched everything with a joyful grin, since no one was happy about this wedding. She knew that it was their Oscar who was supposed to become related to the Marquis's house. At that very moment, she asked her mother with a smile if this was so. Madame declared that it was completely unbecoming of his position to marry in such a place. The Duchess simply could not believe that the Emperor allowed a wedding to be held in such a temple. She considered it simply a disgrace for their house. Sophie said with a smile that the young man still doesn't understand the dangers of arrogance. Madame stated that he was a child and lived away from his family and, of course, had not learned good manners. She said that everything he did was a hindrance to her son, so she said that he was just an ungrateful boy. The Duke was furious, but did not answer. The madam understood that her son was very worried about this, and that is why he brought himself to this state. Sophie turned to her son to tell his grandmother something, but she didn't see him. She was shocked and did not understand where her son had gone. The maid reported that the young man had left because he wanted to go to the restroom. At the same time, Oscar walked slowly through the corridors of the temple, as this situation really irritated him. She understood that if his brother wanted to get married, he could do it quietly, without unnecessary noise. He could not believe that his brother had dragged her into such a place. Walking leisurely along the corridors, he came across the open door to my room. The young man glanced into the room as he assumed that this was where the bride's room was. But at that very moment, he saw a beautiful bride who was sitting quietly. He froze in place as he was struck by her beauty. Oscar froze in place and opened his mouth as he was struck by the beauty of the young lady. Without wasting a minute, he opened the doors to the bride's room. At that very moment, he introduced himself with a satisfied smile and joy. Smiling, he said that they would soon become a family, so he came to greet her. At that very moment, he declared that she was too beautiful for his brother, and that he would be much better suited to her. He knew he simply couldn't give such a sleeping Badial woman to someone like his brother, and so he wanted to take her for himself. At that moment, the young lady was filled with rage as she saw the man who had killed her sister, and his ridiculous flirting only fueled her rage. She looked at him with fury and called out. Oscar's son asked with a satisfied smile if he had really won her heart. Ari said furiously that it was not so, and his face was like a flattened starfish stuck to a rock. She screamed that he should go back to his family before she threw him into the ocean. The young man stood frozen in a daze. At that moment, he screamed in rage because he did not understand how she could say such a thing to him. She screamed that the very fact of his existence was already an insult enough. He began to shout and be indignant. But at that moment, Damen entered the room and angrily asked his brother what he was doing in his fiancée's room. Oscar was taken aback, as he did not expect to see his brother. But the young man stated that it was his line. At that moment, he looked at his brother with fury and told him to stay away from his bride. Oscar angrily asked his brother who he was to do anything to him. Damen immediately rushed menacingly to his brother. At that moment, he put his hand on his brother's shoulder and said that it seemed like he still hadn't learned something. Damien said quietly but angrily that this time his precious Duchess would not be able to intervene. Damien told his brother that without him he was just a pathetic, worthless person, incapable of even standing up for himself. Damien told his brother with fury and contempt that he had better shut his mouth and leave. For a moment, a dead silence enveloped them. But after a few seconds, Oscar looked at his brother with fury and cursed. Ariscilia immediately asked the young man to leave the room quickly. She angrily declared that if he did not leave immediately, she would call the guards. He was shocked because he didn't expect this. Damien, with a haughty grin, asked if his brother really wanted to go back to the sea, since, as his bride put it, he was a starfish. Oscar could not tolerate this and left the room at that very moment. At that very moment, Audrey screamed, hoping that the young man had not seen her mistress. She screamed that he must leave the room immediately. He sighed heavily and said that he had not seen anything in this room, so they did not need to worry. At that moment, he, leaving, apologized for disturbing him, but the young lady called out to him. She looked after him with a smile and declared that she was very beautiful today, so he shouldn't be surprised later. Damien sighed and said that he understood her, but his face was cold. After some time, the high priest announced the groom's arrival with a smile. The young man walked slowly towards the high priest. At the same time, he walked to the applause of all the guests present. The young ladies looked at the groom with tears in their eyes and hoped that he would be happy. After some time, he stood in the center waiting for his bride. The priest looked intently into the distance and with a smile announced that it was now time for the main character of the day, namely, the bride, to come out. At that very moment, everyone greeted the young lady with thunderous applause. The crown prince stood frozen in a daze when he saw his friend, for she was truly beautiful. Iris looked at her sister with a joyful smile as she was very happy for her. Damien, in turn, froze in admiration, as he now clearly understood his bride's recent words. The young lady, in turn, walked slowly arm in arm with her father down the aisle. She looked at everyone around her with a gentle smile, enjoying the wonderful moment. A few minutes later, the young lady approached her groom. The Marquis looked at his daughter with a tender smile and called her, and at the same moment handed his daughter into the hands of the groom. At that very moment, Damien, frozen in place, extended his hand to his bride. He was embarrassed because he saw that she was the most beautiful in the world. At that very moment, the realization came to him that in front of him was his bride, his new family. The high priest looked closely at the young people and asked the groom if he swears before God to take the young lady as his wife and love her for the rest of his life. The young man, without a shred of doubt, quickly replied that he swears. At that very moment, the priest turned to the bride with a smile. She, smiling, said that she swears. The priest looked closely at the young people and said with a smile that they could now exchange rings. Damien slowly took the ring and looked at it intently. Ari extended her hand to him with a smile. Damien Robko put a ring on his wife. Ari, in turn, slowly took the ring and looked tenderly at her husband. She put the ring on his finger, and a moment later it glowed and changed color. Ari looked at her husband with a smile and said that she had hopes for him from now on. He froze in surprise as he did not expect such words. But a moment later, he changed his expression and said with an embarrassed smile that he also hoped for her. The young lady couldn't help but laugh out loud. A moment later, the high priest, smiling, announced before God that the young people were now husband and wife. At that very moment, everyone joyfully greeted the newlyweds. The young people looked intently into the distance as they understood that their plan had been a success. At the same time, the bride's family looked at their little one with joy and tears in their eyes. But the groom's family was unhappy with this, and they just had to come to terms with what had happened. The prince quietly told his subordinate to wait for his order. He said angrily that by threats or persuasion or something else, let that man find out from the priest with whom his girlfriend met that they had certified by a notary. After the festive wedding ceremony, a banquet was held. The young people happily congratulated their mentor on her wedding. The vice captain also congratulated the captain on his wedding with a joyful smile and wished the newlyweds unearthly happiness and a strong family life. The groom happily accepted congratulations from his friends and acquaintances, also gave everyone a radiant smile and thanked everyone for their kind words. At that very moment, the young bride was distracted because someone called her. She greeted her friend with a joyful smile. Paula smiled and congratulated the young lady on her wonderful day, and she also noted that the bride was very beautiful. Paula told her friend that she could never have dreamed that she would get married, and yet she became the wife of a wonderful husband. Ari was taken aback by this and said that he was not that good. Her friend said with a smile that she was just joking, while her husband was puzzled by her words. Ari looked at her friend in bewilderment and asked where Frederick was. Paula stated that the prince had just left in a hurry, so she assumed he had some urgent business to attend to. Ari thanked her friend with a smile for the information and said that they should all meet if possible. A moment later, Damien was taken aback as he heard a familiar voice, and he flinched. The madam looked at her grandson with fury and asked what he was allowing himself to do. She asked angrily if his mother had never taught him that on an important day the first thing one should do is greet one's elders. Ari looked closely at Madame, for this was the woman her husband had warned her about. She saw his paternal grandmother. Before the wedding, the young people met, and Ari asked if they should visit the duchy. She stated that they should show respect to his grandmother, but the young man said there was no need to greet his grandmother. After all, she looks more like his older brother's grandmother than his, and if she doesn't want to listen to insults, then it's better for them not to go to her. For some time, the young people stood quietly and looked intently at Madame. The madam looked closely at her grandson and asked again if he had not been taught to greet his elders first on important days. The young lady was furious as she immediately went on to insult her mother. Damien sighed and greeted his grandmother. Ari greeted Madame with a smile and introduced herself, stating that she very much hoped that they would get along well. The lady looked at the girl with fury and contempt and declared that her greeting was indecently belated. At the same time, she stated that she heard that she did not have time to visit the duchy, but she found time for the wedding. Her Naledi only laughed in response. She said with a smile that they were very lucky that they had no urgent matters to attend to today, and she grabbed her husband by the sleeve. She looked at her husband with a smile and asked if that wasn't true. He was surprised because she had just called him by his name. Madame looked at the girl with fury and declared that she was addressing her, Aria, looking away, asked for forgiveness because she did not always catch such nuances. At that very moment, she said that she was now Ariscilia Vandermeer, so she asked Madame if she hadn't gotten used to it yet. At the same time, she stated that the new things were confusing, and she understood everything and would not remind her of anything. Madame only looked at the lady with fury. At that very moment, she turned to her grandson and declared that he had indeed found a bride to suit himself. The young man only calmly thanked her for such words. As she left, Madame only looked at them with a smirk and declared that they were both shameless. And at the same time, she wanted to see how far this would lead them. After Madame left, there was silence in the hall for some time. Damien, in turn, sighed heavily, although this situation was extremely unpleasant for him. Ari, in turn, moved closer to her husband and stated that she was very nervous, but asked if everything had turned out okay. He was taken aback and said that everything was fine, considering the sudden situation, and she acted perfectly because she even naturally used his name. Ari said with a smile that they were now married, and that was natural. And she also said that he could now call her by her first name. Damien thought about her words for a moment, but at the same moment, looking away, he said embarrassedly that he preferred to call her his wife. Ari was taken aback and drawled that it was simply disgusting. Damien puzzledly told her to watch her facial expressions, as people were looking at them. At that moment, she looked back and realized that all eyes were directed at them. They quickly activated fake couple mode, Ari saying that they should take on the girlfriend role instead of correcting their facial expressions, but he said that he didn't want to do that. She asked with a smile what kind of married couple they were if they didn't even walk arm in arm at their own reception. Iris, in turn, watched her sister with joy. Damien sighed heavily and said that in that case he would just put his arm around her shoulders. The young lady flinched for a moment as he put his arm around her, but at that very moment she saw a hovering hand, the highest level of mastery, while he maintained a perfect gap of 1 millimeter. After some time, the young maid asked her mistress if she was nervous. After all, her wedding night would soon take place. Ari declared about her servant that she knew her husband very well. She knew perfectly well that the young man would not allow anyone to touch him under any circumstances. But with all this, Audrey had a different opinion, because she knew that the gentleman was much larger than her, and she was worried that he could crush her in her sleep. Ari smiled and told her maid that she didn't need to worry about such things, because nothing like that would happen. A moment later, she shouted with a smile to her maid to go to bed, as it was already late. Ari slowly approached the door. She understood that her wedding night would soon be over, but she understood that this was just a performance for the ducal family. The young lady slowly knocked on the door and saw her husband. She looked at him in surprise, as it was the first time she had seen him with his hair down. Ariscilia, in turn, entered the room without a drop of embarrassment. But a few moments later, she screamed, and the young man asked in bewilderment what was wrong. She was shocked and asked him why there were swords hanging on the wall. She screamed that it was ominous. He asked in bewilderment if she had forgotten that he was a knight. She said that he seemed to have forgotten that she was a magician, and therefore if he were to hang the sword, then the staff should hang there too. He sighed and said that he would order it. The young lady did not stop and said that there was something else. At that very moment, she said that they should play rock, paper, scissors to decide who would get the bed because she didn't want to sleep together. Damien sighed and stated that she could use the bed. She smiled and asked if they would take turns every night. He said that she would simply use it since he was unlikely to sleep in the residence often. At that very moment, she shouted that he must not change his mind, and with that, she fell into bed. The young lady, in turn, was happy with the soft bed, and her husband looked at her with a smile. She was glad to have received such bliss because she was very tired. Damien, in turn, slowly poured himself some wine and sipped it quietly. Ari looked at him in bewilderment and asked if he really liked alcohol. He said that he only drank it because it was in front of him. Ari asked in surprise if he really drank that well. She asked because he already looked a little tipsy. He sighed and said that he couldn't drink much. She asked in surprise if he really had a limit of 1 glass. He was embarrassed and puzzled, so he shouted at her to mind her own business and go to bed already. She sighed and said that she didn't want to sleep next to a drunk. Damien told his wife that she didn't need to worry because he didn't get rowdy and usually fell asleep right away. Ari looked closely at the young man as she saw that he was indeed drunk and would soon fall asleep. The next morning, Ari slept quietly in her new bed. But after some time, she woke up as she realized that it was already morning. She stretched slowly and yawned heavily as she realized that she would soon have to get ready for work. But at that very moment, she heard some noise and looked at her husband in bewilderment. She was puzzled because she saw that he was not in his best shape. Ari looked at her husband in bewilderment as she did not understand what had happened. She hurried to him and began to wake him up. But he did not wake up. Writhing in agony, he begged not to be touched. At this, the young lady was taken aback as she saw that he was crying and calling for his mother. The young man, in turn, was transported back to his childhood in his dream. He saw the estate in the duchy where his mother had lived during his childhood. But a moment later, the young man consoled himself as he heard a familiar voice. He stood still for a moment at the door as Madame called him. She asked him to hurry before it was too late. Damien quickly reached for the door as he was sure that his mother had called him. She quietly said that he was a good boy, but she didn't know what they should do. She quietly whispered that there was no more time and that she was moving further and further away from him. Damien was taken aback and cried out, but at the same time he reached out to her. At that very moment, he clearly heard his wife's voice and opened his eyes as she asked him to wake up. Ari looked at her husband with concern and asked if everything was okay. He froze for a moment in embarrassment, but at that very moment he pushed her away and shouted at her not to touch him. Ari was shocked by what she heard, because she just wanted to help him. She was furious and screamed that she had woken him only because he was having a nightmare. Without looking up, he stated that he had not asked her to do so. Turning away from his wife, he told her not to meddle in other people's affairs and not to try to look like a benefactor. She was shocked and did not understand why he had been acting that way towards her since the morning, since they had only just gotten married yesterday. She hurried out of the room, burning with anger and shouting that it was all her fault and that she would not wake him up again, so he could rest easy. He said that now that she understood everything, she should leave quickly. Ari was furious and shouted that she was going to leave anyway, so he didn't have to say such a thing. Damien, in turn, was puzzled by everything that was happening. He sighed heavily and remembered the expression on his wife's face, and at the same time he realized that he did not need to share a room with her. The young lady, in turn, flew out of the room like a stray, angry bullet, while the maid looked at her mistress in bewilderment, as she did not understand where she was heading in such a state. She screamed furiously that she would go, change her clothes, and have breakfast. Sometime later, the young lady sat quietly in the dining room, surrounded by maids. She was furious at this because she knew that newlyweds should not have breakfast separately. A moment later, she looked away in my direction, puzzled, as someone greeted her. Colin asked the young lady with a smile if she had enjoyed her breakfast. She greeted him with a smile and said that she liked everything, but in turn, she asked what brought him to her. He stated that yesterday at the banquet he had not managed to greet her properly, and as an assistant accompanying the master, he intended to be useful to her in the future as well. Ari looked at him with a smile and said that she would be glad to cooperate with them. He said with a smile that after breakfast she should take a look at the list of maids that he had prepared and who would henceforth look after the mansion. Ari thanked him with a smile for his help. Audrey quietly told her mistress that she would have to go out soon. A moment later, the young lady thanked everyone for the food and announced that she had to go to work. The maid came up to them in a hurry and announced that she would clear away the dishes. Ari looked at the young maid in surprise and asked her name. Rosalind smiled and introduced herself. The young lady looked closely at the maid and allowed her to do the same. But also looking at the maid, she wondered if she really had anything to say, because she noticed how the maid had been looking at her intently from the moment she entered the dining room. Rosalind was taken aback and asked the lady for forgiveness because it was her first day and she was a little nervous. Ariscilia told the maid that she had nothing to apologize for. She had just been staring so intently that she wondered why. Colin looked at the maid in bewilderment. At that same moment, the other maids looked at each other sideways. Audrey was taken aback as she saw that the atmosphere had become somewhat strange. She understood that if this continued, it would not be good for her mistress. Audrey said with a smile that the maid simply could not take her eyes off her beauty, because her beauty truly enchanted people. Ariscilia looked at her maid with a smile, as she was pleasantly surprised and embarrassed by her words. But she also knew that her maid always spoke the truth. Audrey said with a smile that her mistress was incredibly beautiful. Colin looked at his mistress with a smile and announced that they would see her out. She was in no hurry, but was heading towards the exit when suddenly the other servants greeted her with a joyful smile. She saw that they were all polite and courteous to her, and at the same time the new day brought her joy. As they left the main hall, the maids greeted her and asked if she had rested well. The young lady, in turn, did not keep them waiting long, so she greeted everyone with a joyful smile. She walked slowly and said that she was not a picky housewife, so it would not be difficult for them all to serve her. She smiled and stated that she was often busy with estate affairs, so they wouldn't have much work. At that very moment, she introduced everyone to her trusted maid, and with a smile, she said that she very much hoped they would all get along with her. Ariscilia stated that if they had any questions, they could contact her through her personal maid. As she left, she said goodbye to them with a joyful smile and said that she was counting on their help and support. The maid smiled back at her and wished her a safe journey. That day, the young lady first took on the role of the new mistress of the house. She tried to show kindness to everyone around her, namely to the servants who are not accustomed to the presence of the mistress. However, even the best intentions can be misinterpreted, and the young lady did not yet realize this. At the same time, the young maid looked at her mistress with a predatory grin, since from the first day the spouses would be apart tomorrow, so she intended to report this as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, after reading the report, Madame sipped her tea with a contented smile, as she was surprised that immediately after the marriage, the young people had breakfast separately. She assumed that they probably slept in different rooms. The lady looked at her husband with a smile and asked if he wanted to read the reports, but the Duke angrily put the document aside and slapped the chair. She looked at her husband in bewilderment and asked what was wrong with him, and she trembled and asked if there was really something wrong with the Emperor's letter. The Duke angrily said that he did not know whether the gods were on their side, so he turned to his wife and declared that she must convey something to the spy on their son's estate. He looked at his husband with a predatory grin and said that this spy should do everything to deceive the young people. After some time, the madam looked at her daughter in surprise, as she knew that she already had her own new family, but she still came to their house very often. She asked her daughter if she had had a fight with her husband, and Aries said with a smile that this was not the case and that they were both just very busy. Madame was puzzled, as she understood that two identical people had met on the same path. The Marquis sighed heavily and asked his wife not to say such words. He smiled and said that thanks to this, they could often see their beloved daughter. Madame said that this was true, but she was still worried. She sighed and said that she had tried to persuade her to take other maids to the new estates until the very end. But in the end, the young daughter took only Audrey. Aries smiled and said that everything was fine, and the head maid in her husband's house had already found new maids. Madame looked closely at her daughter and asked excitedly if she remembered what her mother had told her about the most important thing for the new mistress of the estate. She sighed and said that the most important thing is how many of your people you have on the estate. Ariscilia said with a smile that she remembered everything, and when she got used to running the household, she would try to find someone else. The Marquis froze in shock. He wanted his daughter to not provoke her mother again and not say such things. In turn, the young lady sat and quietly enjoyed the delicious cookies. The madam looked at her daughter with fury and declared that this could not be done. She told her daughter that she had to come home early today. Ariscilia was in shock as her mother was throwing her out of the house. She said that it wasn't like that, and no matter how busy they were, the fact that she came to her parents' house every weekend was not good. Madame understood that they had their own family life, but it is usually strange when newlyweds spend so much time apart. Madame said that one day this could cause a scandal. The young lady, in turn, looked at her mother in bewilderment. She did not understand what was so terrible about some ridiculous gossip. At the same time, Madame told her daughter that she should leave early and have dinner with her husband. After some time, the young lady returned to her new home, and at that very moment she was taken aback as her husband called her. Ariscilia looked at her husband with bewilderment and asked what brought him home at such a time. He looked at her intently and stated that he had something he wanted to discuss with her. At that moment, he announced with a gentle smile that they needed to go to the bedroom for a short while. Ariscilia looked at her husband with bewilderment and indignation and asked why he had suggested something like this so suddenly. But after a few seconds, she froze in place and was filled with embarrassment as her husband came close to her. Damien Takonko told his wife that a letter had arrived from the emperor. Looking at his wife with an intent gaze, he said that it would be better to discuss the matter further where they would be alone. She shuddered at the same moment, but realized that the matter was serious. After some time, they sat silently, looking at each other in the room. A moment after reading the letter, she asked if the emperor would not now recognize his right of succession. Damien said angrily that it was so, and he added another condition for becoming the heir. He declared that only the one who personally found the will of the late duke could become the heir. The young lady sighed heavily because she already thought that something serious was planned. At that very moment, she declared that they should simply find the will and bring it to the emperor, and that's all. The young man was taken aback and declared that it was not as simple as it seemed at first glance. He stated that his grandfather's will was still being passed from mouth to different people, but no one knows where the real will is. Aries stated that perhaps the emperor knew where the will was, and that was why he had made such a condition. Damien said that his grandfather was a close friend of the emperor during his lifetime, so it was quite possible. And since nothing was known for sure, his father also could not simply appoint an heir. The young lady was puzzled, as she understood that the situation was very delicate and they could simply spend decades on divorce. He sighed heavily and asked for forgiveness, as he did not expect such an outcome. Ari looked at her husband closely and stated that, although it irritated her, they should first think about how to solve this problem. And if this was coming from the emperor, there must be a reason for it. Damien declared that everything was correct, and therefore they must, at any cost, find the will, since what the emperor wanted was always the same. The emperor of the empire, Cetron, was an extremely ruthless man. He was the one who fled, who eliminated all the brothers and ascended to the imperial throne. If necessary, this cold-blooded man is ready to shake hands even with the devil just to fulfill his desire. Namely, he wanted superior power over everyone. Ari looked closely at her husband and asked if that was true, but her letter had also been sent to the duke. Damien Vizdia said with a sigh that the people of the Herzen house were probably already tormenting themselves, unable to find the will, but he knew that for now they had more advantages, since the grandfather's last will had already been fulfilled and they only had to find the will. She stated that the ducal house would try by any means possible to find the will and hide it. Damien assured his wife that she did not need to worry, as he was monitoring their actions and he intended to ensure that his father did not get hold of the will in any way. He sighed and said that she should understand that he would probably be busy solving this problem in the near future. She said that she understood him, but he should let her know if something happened. Damien agreed with her and stated that he would report to her regularly about the situation. A moment later, the young man left the room. The young lady watched him closely, and at the same time she was puzzled by the situation, as she understood that things were getting more complicated. Although she understood that she could not influence the outcome of the situation and did not know what to do now, but at that very moment she raised her morale and declared to herself that she would do what was in her power. And in doing so, she intended to go into the world of magic. The emperor's sudden change in the conditions of succession had a very strong impact on the young people, but they still intended, no matter what, to make sure that Damien became the heir. But at the same time, the Duke and Duchess intended to prevent Damien from inheriting the title, and each side, for their own purposes, began to search for the will of the late Duke. Meanwhile, the young maid stood quietly behind the main building and read the message from her mistress. She understood that it was time for her to do her business. At the same time, she intended to isolate Ariscilia in the mansion, and she also wanted to tempt the gentleman in order to distance him from his wife and bring their marriage to divorce. She read the letter with a grin, as she understood that for that kind of money, she would be willing to do anything. The young maid called her friend with a smile and said that it was time for them to hang out the laundry. Rosalie smiled and told her friend that she was on her way. A moment later, the young ladies leisurely went about their business. The girl told her friend with a smile that the weather outside was nice and the laundry would dry quickly. Rosalie agreed with a smile. A moment later, the other maids asked their friend why she was always late. Rosalie smiled and apologized, saying that she would try to do everything quickly. She looked closely at her new friends because she knew that they had very long tongues. She looked at them with a fierce grin, as she knew that they would be perfect for her intended plan. The girl looked at Rosalie with a smile and said that she might be a little late, since last time Rosalie cleaned the dining room instead of her. Rosalie said with a smile about her friend that she was sick then, and of course she had to help her. The girl, perplexed, told her friend that she simply could not believe that the owners had previously tormented such a good Rosalind just because she was so beautiful. She assumed that it was very difficult for her. Rosalia, with a smile, thanked her friend for understanding her. A moment later, the young maid said with a smile that the current owners were not like that, and Rosalie did not need to worry about such things. They said that their mistress was a very simple and kind person by nature. They knew that, unlike other noble ladies, she generally did not pick on them. At that very moment, Rosalie's expression changed, and she sadly declared that she thought the same. But after a moment, she looked away in my direction and said that she didn't need to say anything. The maid looked at her friend in surprise and said that everything was fine, and she could say whatever she wanted. They said that it would remain just between them and asked what happened. Rosalie said that the thing was that their mistress did not pick on them, and that was really good. But at that very moment, she asked the maids whether they had ever received any instructions from their mistress regarding estate matters. The young ladies hesitated and said that they had received nothing from her, and even meetings with her were rare. Rosalie, trembling, said that it was all true, and that was why she felt uneasy and worried. And perhaps the mistress didn't like either the estate or them. That was why she was so indifferent to them. Though with tears in her eyes, she declared that she wanted to serve her masters as long as possible. She touched her new friends very much, and they looked at her with tears in their eyes. At that very moment, they declared that she was, to some extent, right. They began to whisper, because they knew that their mistress went to her parents' house every weekend and she returned to the estate very late. They were puzzled, because they had not thought about this before. At the same time, the young maid rejoiced with joy, since everything was going according to her plan, and she was already on the way to isolating the mistress. She understood that things would go easier than she expected. A few days after Rosaline had set her plan in motion, the handmaids began to whisper loudly that their masters had quarreled. At the same time, they said that the lady almost never stayed in the mansion for long, just like the gentleman. And at the same time they collided and limited themselves to short greetings with each other, they assumed that in such a situation, the Lord could get divorced. Audrey listened to the whispers of her new friends with bewilderment, and she did not like the situation at all. After some time, the maids served their mistress food. At the same time, Audrey looked closely at everyone present, as she saw that the atmosphere in the mansion had been strange lately. She wanted to know what exactly the maids had been whispering about earlier, as she had not heard the entire conversation. Rosalind smiled and informed the lady that she had brought tea after the meal. Aries smiled and thanked her. But at that very moment, the young maid put her plan into action and deliberately dropped the tray containing the hot tea, and Audrey turned pale from shock as she stood there. But at the same time, the young lady calmly looked at her dirty suit. Rosalie, with horror on her face, hastily asked her mistress for forgiveness. She quickly fell to her knees before the lady and asked her to forgive her at least this time. She screamed that it was indeed an accident and she had made a big mistake, but she still asked for leniency. All the maids froze in shock and looked at their friend tremblingly. Audrey was taken aback and wondered why the maid had humiliated herself so pathetically. She understood that the girl behaved in this way and only complicated the situation for her mistress. Rosalie, in turn, waited for a response with a smirk. She understood that there were too many apologies, and at the same time, apologies only worsened the situation and made people angrier. Besides, she saw that her new friends had already begun to sympathize with her. Arie came closer to the maid, but she began to scream and beg for forgiveness. At the same time, she looked at the mistress with a fierce grin because she wanted her to shout at her and quickly. But the young lady only reached out to her with a smile and said something, and simply stumbled because he was stealthily looking at her beautiful face. The young maid looked at her mistress in bewilderment as she had not expected anything like this. Arie smiled and told her maid that she didn't need to be so nervous and could look at her openly. Ariscilia gave the maid a radiant smile and declared that she was her maid, so she would not even charge her for such a spectacle. She said with a smile that only now could she look at her to her heart's content. The young maid was shocked by this, as she did not expect anything like this at all, but still, puzzled, smiling. She thanked her mistress for this. Ariscilia said with a satisfied smile that today she was still flawless and shone with beauty from all sides. The maid was in shock and understood that she simply could not compare with her mistress. At that moment, another maid presented her mistress with a clean towel and new tea. The young lady thanked her with a smile. Rosalie was shocked because she wanted the rumors to spread beyond the mansion, so she understood that she needed to organize something grand. She slowly walked away from her mistress when suddenly she turned around because Audrey called her. Audrey glared at the young maid and said that she had been making too many mistakes lately. She said that she knew perfectly well that she was new, but it was getting out of hand. She looked menacingly at the young maid and asked her to pull herself together and serve her mistress properly from now on. Rosalie froze in place with rage, and then she realized that she had found a new clue. At that very moment, she asked for forgiveness with a fierce grin, and she declared with a fierce grin on her face that this would never happen again. Sometime later, in the magic tower, a tired young lady told her comrades that they were simply doomed because the work simply did not stop. Sally, with tears in her eyes, asked her eldest what they should do, because even if they combined all the types of magic stones produced in the Empire, the result would only last a week. Rudy sighed heavily and stated that given that the final presentation of the artifact was already close, he didn't know if they would actually be able to finish. The young lady was puzzled, as she knew that they wouldn't be able to make it in time. But at that very moment, Ari looked closely at her comrades and declared that Anna was a genius poppy who graduated from the academy with the best results, and she entered the magic tower as the best graduate, and she would definitely find a way to ensure that the research was crowned with success. She said that they should trust her and take the next day off. They were shocked and did not understand what she was saying, because they were already short of time, and they even worked overtime every day. They understood that they had to redo everything from document analysis to submission methods. Ari looked at her comrades closely and asked what she told them to do when research wasn't progressing. They sighed and stated that they needed to try to approach the issue from a new angle. She said with a smile that everything was right, and now was the time when they needed to take a break. So she again asked them to trust her and rest a little. They looked at their eldest with tears in their eyes, as they knew she was the best. They said that they would take a little rest and work even harder. The young lady said goodbye to them with a joyful smile. After some time, she returned to her house. She understood that she had told her friends to rest, but she still had to work a little. Audrey greeted her mistress with a smile on her face, and she noticed that she was carrying a heavy stone and asked the mistress to give it to her. Ari said with a smile that she would carry the stone herself because it was very important. But at the same moment she declared that she actually wanted to ask her for a favor, Damen looked closely at his wife as he noticed that she had returned. She turned around and called her husband, as she did not expect him to come so early. He looked at her intently and declared that he needed to go inside too, so she should hurry up. She was puzzled because he was saying in other words that she should stop standing in the way and leave quickly. She didn't know if she should raise an argument this time. At that moment, she remembered her mother's words that marriage was their personal matter. She remembered her mother saying that usually, if newlyweds spent so much time apart, people would start to find it strange, and such things could eventually turn into a scandal. She sighed heavily, as she knew that their story should be a happy marriage. At that very moment, the young lady's expression changed, and she greeted her husband with a smile. She smiled and said that she had just been so busy that she had not been able to see him for a while. And now that she saw him again, she was simply overjoyed, and she had completely forgotten to go inside. The young lady hoped that she had explained it clearly to him and that he had understood her hint. At this point, the young man froze in shock, as he had not expected such a thing. He was too tired to understand the hints, and so he asked in bewilderment if that was all. She was furious, as he was very irritating. At that very moment, he noticed with bewilderment that she was holding a stone that was the same size as herself. Ari looked tired and asked what was wrong as he was staring at her intently. Damen reached for the stone and stated that it looked very heavy, so he wanted to take it away. But the young lady stated that she could carry it herself just fine. He sighed heavily and said with sadness in his voice that she did not need to pretend to be strong, because she had been sitting in the laboratory all this time without sunlight, and therefore he assumed that she could harm herself if this stone was carried. The lady, in turn, looked at him with fury, as she understood that he simply wanted to drive her crazy. At that very moment, she shouted that he didn't understand anything, because this was her long-awaited masterpiece, which she had been working on for almost 6 months, and it was nothing more than a levitating stone. She proudly shouted that it was incredibly light and hovers very high, and that it was enough to charge it with mana and it would work for a whole week, and this example was the best of all. She looked at her husband intently, holding back her emotions, and declared that he was her husband, and she would grant him the special privilege of seeing the stone in action first. He was taken aback, as he realized what she wanted to show him. The young lady looked at her husband with a joyful smile and declared that he should look at the miracle carefully. A moment later, she conceived a stone with her mana, and her husband froze in shock. He was surprised because the stone was actually floating in the air. Damien looked at the stone with surprise and admiration, because he did not expect that a stone of such a size would simply hang in the air. So he understood that this action was simply incredible. She said with a smile that she had told him such a thing, because it was her proud creation. But at that very moment, the young lady could not bear the load and fell to the ground with a crash. The young man was shocked by this. He did not expect anything like this, but at the same time, he managed to catch her with ease. He froze in place when he saw his tired wife in his arms. Audrey was taken aback and screamed, as she did not expect such a thing. "Not a minute right now." The young man shouted to the maid to call the doctor immediately, while he was very frightened by the condition of his wife. After some time, the young lady came to her senses and happily stated that she felt well, because she had managed to get enough sleep. For this reason, she asked her husband for forgiveness for yesterday. The young man was puzzled, as he did not like all this. The doctor stated that the young lady was weakened due to the overuse of her mana. So he said that if she had a good rest and ate well, everything would have a positive effect on the restoration of mana, and she would quickly recover. As he was leaving, he said that she should take good care of her health. Damien sighed heavily and said that if she hadn't decided to brag to him yesterday, everything would have been fine. The young lady was furious, and she screamed that it was all because of him, because he made her angry. He was shocked and screamed that now she should not eat any more cookies and should eat normally. Damien stated that he would ask her to prepare food that would help her restore her mana. But the young lady casually said that she ate good enough food, because even when she was a child, her mana was depleted and she ate cookies. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked if mana could really be restored even after such a meal. She sighed and stated that it all depended on the person. Furthermore, the amount of mana depended on willpower. Mana is an energy that is intertwined with nature and even air. Since mana consists of tiny particles, ordinary people cannot feel it, much less use it. The chosen ones, who could feel, absorb, and use mana, are magicians. She asked in surprise if Aura really needed any specific food to recover. The young man thought for a moment and said that the aura also depends on the person, but usually products that can strengthen the body are the best for recovery. If mana is the external force, then aura is the life force flowing within. All living beings can feel it, and with the right training, use it. Among them, only those who have trained strong bodies can become a master of the aura. Damien stated that since the aura is produced inside the body, it must generate powerful energy. Therefore, for its generation, products that can quickly improve the aura or strengthen the body are better suited. The young lady was taken aback and asked him to repeat this part. Damien looked at her with bewilderment and calmly stated that the aura is produced inside the body, and it should generate powerful energy. At that moment, the young lady was taken aback because she had not thought of such a thing before. She cried out joyfully that this was the way out of the situation, and she needed to think about synchronizing the energy and the levitating stones on a larger scale. She cried out that her narrow thinking was hindering her research. At that moment, Aerie rushed to her husband with a joyful smile and thanked him. She said with a joyful smile that thanks to him, she had made a breakthrough in the research of the limiting stone. He was taken aback for a moment and froze in embarrassment, but at the same moment, with a joyful smile, he declared that he was very glad to be of service. Without wasting a minute, she rushed to the door and declared that she had to return to the magic tower right now. She also shouted that she would contact him later. The young man breathed a sigh of relief, but at the same time thought that his wife was just a weirdo. At the same time, the young lady, despite everything, happily ran to meet her new research. Meanwhile, the young maid was puzzled by everything that was happening, as she understood that everything had become much more complicated. Previously, she felt that they didn't get along with each other. But because of their mistress's fainting spell, their bond became much stronger. Rumors quickly spread throughout the estate, and the maids talked about nothing but their masters. They discussed how the master had been very nervous after his wife had fainted, and yet he had raised everyone to their feet. Rosalie was furious because she knew it shouldn't have come to this, and she understood the gravity of the whole situation, so she wanted to do something quickly. After some time, she leisurely entered the warehouse. She knew that today was the day when she exchanged letters. A moment later, she found a bag of supplies which contained the treasured letter. She slowly opened the letter with further instructions. At the same time, she read the letter from her mistress and noticed that the mistress was beside herself with anger and asked the maid when she would finally separate them completely. She wanted the young servant to seduce Damien. Found the young lady's weakness? Rosalie was furious and did not understand why the stupid noblewoman continued to insist on seducing the young knight. She understood that if she tried to do this now, all her efforts would go down the drain. so she wanted to first report everything that was happening. But moments later, she turned around in a hurry because someone called her. The head maid looked at the maid in bewilderment and asked why she was in such a place, since she was not in charge of the food today. Rosalie smiled and stated that she had a spare minute and decided to help in the kitchen. The head maid understood and stated that she should go and clean the outbuilding instead. She stated that Audrey was already there and it would be difficult for her to do it alone, so she should go and help. At that moment, the young maid realized that this was a very wonderful opportunity. She said with a smile that she would go quickly and help her. A moment later, she shouted with a joyful smile for the handmaid to wait for her. Audrey turned around and looked at the young lady in surprise. Rosalie asked her friend with a happy smile if she was really going to clean the outbuilding. Without wasting a minute, she said that she would take care of the vow and she could go and rest. Audrey looked at her in confusion as she knew that the place she had been given was too big to clean alone. She wondered why they couldn't do it together. Rosalie smiled and stated that she felt awkward after the incident, and that was why she wanted to do everything herself. Audrey was puzzled and asked if this was true, but she said that if the girl really wanted it, then so be it. But she asked her not to convince herself too much. Rosalie thanked her friend with a smile for her understanding. A moment later, Rosalie looked into the distance at the extension with a joyful smile, as she understood that her plan had succeeded. At that very moment, she noticed her friends walking along. They greeted her with a joyful smile. At the same time, they asked where she was going, and she immediately stated that she was going to clean the outbuilding. The young maid was surprised that her friend was going alone to clean such a huge place. She smiled and timidly said that Audrey told her to do it herself because she had made a lot of mistakes before and needed to focus and think about her behavior. They looked at their friend in bewilderment as they knew that the mistress had not scolded her. She looked at them intently and asked if they remembered that on the first day, the mistress had said that from now on they would communicate with her through Audrey, so she assumed that the mistress meant this. She looked at the girls with a fierce grin because the lady was saying something similar in a different key, but she knew that now she could pull the blanket to her side. They asked in bewilderment whether this meant that the lady was angry with her. Rosalie said with a smile that the lady had no shortcomings and it was all her fault. The girls said with a smile that they would help her, and if they did everything together, they would finish quickly. With tears in her eyes, she thanked them for their help. At that moment, the young maid's expression changed, and she stated that since Audrey had told her to do it alone, if she found out that someone had helped, she might get angry, so she wanted them to keep it all a secret. The young maid said with a smile that they would keep everything a secret, and she didn't need to worry. So they asked her to hurry up since they were helping behind the head maid's back. They needed to finish faster. She was pleased with herself as she had intended to isolate Audrey, so she understood that questions about the affairs of the mansion would not reach the lady's ears, and she could find her weakness later. After some time, the maid told her friend that Audrey asked her to convey a message that she should clean the toilet room, because Audrey said that she needed to help her mistress. The girl was shocked, because she saw literally a few minutes ago that Audrey was resting. There they began to whisper about the schedule, since Audrey was the one making it. They understood that there was nothing surprising in it, and she was giving herself an easy job. At first, they thought she was a good girl and even talked to her, but now she just irritated everyone. They claimed that she was the mistress's favorite maid. The young maid looked at her friends in bewilderment and called them, but at that very moment, she saw their contemptuous glances. One of the maids walked past her and hit her. They looked at her with fury and sideways glances because they understood that she was simply a terrible person. Audrey was shocked and didn't understand what was going on because they had recently started behaving this way. But at that very moment, she was taken aback as she saw a malicious grin on the part of the young maid. She pointed out that it was not at all surprising that the atmosphere in the mansion had seemed strange to her lately, since Rosalie had been behaving very strangely around her mistress. She remembered how recently the young maid had said with a smile that she had made a lot of mistakes lately, and that was why she wanted to do everything herself. Audrey understood that the girl was deliberately taking on an unthinkable burden. At the same time, she looked at the young girl with fury, since she did not understand what she was planning at all. After some time, the young lady slowly returned home, but she was very tired. Audrey looked at the lady with a smile and asked her to change her clothes and have a good rest. Aries sighed heavily and said with a smile that she planned to do so. But at that very moment, she asked her maid to bring her some water and also said that she would change her clothes herself. Audrey said with a smile that she would do everything and would be back soon. A few minutes later, she left her mistress's room and wondered whether she should tell her mistress about everything that was happening in the mansion. She was excited and did not know what the maid was really up to. But in turn, she was aware of the fact that this situation was threatening to become a big problem. She raised the idea that it was better to talk about such things right away. A moment later, the young maid entered her mistress's room and announced that she had brought water. But at that very moment, she froze in place, because she saw that her mistress was fast asleep on a small sofa. She saw that her mistress was too tired. And at the same time, the young maid understood that her mistress had driven herself too far with her research into the limiting stones. She looked at her mistress with tenderness and began to wrap her up, while wondering when her mistress had managed to grow so much. She saw that her mistress had already gotten married and was slowly moving towards her dreams and goals, like a real grown-up lady. She looked at the lady with a gentle smile, as she understood that she could wait a little while with this problem in the mansion, and at the same time she hoped that everything would somehow resolve itself. She saw that her mistress was too busy, and she did not want to bother her with such problems. At this, the young maid laughed, as her mistress, with a contented smile, quietly muttered something. As she tucked her mistress in, she wished her sweet dreams with a smile. The next day, the head maid asked her subordinates if they had checked their schedule for the week. She stated that they should not slack off just because the mistress did not stay long in the mansion, but she also stated that they should work as expected. The maids bowed to the maid and stated that they understood everything. The head maid looked closely at Emmy and asked how the maid could walk around with such a provocative necklace on display. Emmy was taken aback and told her boss that this was her precious gift, namely a memory of her mother. The head maid looked at the servant with fury, but at the same moment she backed away and declared that she would take it off at once and asked for forgiveness. Then the head maid told Rosalind that it was time for her to get rid of her rookie status and start working properly in the mansion. And this time she had to clean out her mistress's dressing room herself. The young maid said with a smile that she would do everything in the best possible way. At that very moment, the head maid announced that they should get to work as soon as possible, and everyone happily agreed. Audrey looked at the maid with a stern and sullen expression, as she understood that she was up to something new. After some time, the young maid slowly walked into her mistress's dressing room. She looked at the room with a fierce grin, because she knew that everything happened at the perfect time, because she was about to start looking for her mistress's weaknesses. After all, she had heard rumors from the maids lately, but all she knew about the mistress was that she was an eccentric magician. However, the young maid understood that her mistress was truly a capable magician, and recently she had even been bringing documents from the magic tower to the estate. She knew that even yesterday her mistress had brought a huge bag into this room, and so she assumed that she might find something worthwhile. Rosalie looked at the territory of her search with a fierce grin, as she intended to crush her mistress. Meanwhile, the young lady was relaxing with her friend, and Paula was asking how her friend was doing with her husband, as she knew that newlyweds were wonderful. Aries sighed heavily and casually said that everything was fine with them. The young lady looked at her friend with a smile and declared that they were only at the beginning of their journey, and at the same time asked if they had any funny stories. At that very moment, the young lady remembered her husband, to whom he had told with a smirk that she had acted arrogantly, but in fact she was just a weakling. She said with a suppressed smile that they had no funny stories because they were both very busy, and they saw each other once or twice on weekends. The young lady was a little puzzled by her friend's words, but still asked how things were going at home. She wanted to know if her friend had any new clashes with her husband's maids. Aries stated that she didn't really care and that she was just living quietly and not sticking her nose into their affairs. The young lady was shocked and screamed that this was not right. She stated that her friend was already often absent due to work in the tower, and that it was simply necessary to manage the maids in her free time. Ari looked at her friend in bewilderment, as she didn't understand why she would do this when they were already doing a good job. Paula told her friend that if she remained silent and sat back, they would start to neglect her, and Ari asked in bewilderment if they were really that stupid. She stated that she had only brought Audrey with her, so their job should be easier. Paula sighed heavily and looked puzzled, but said that was the reason she was so worried. Ari asked her in bewilderment why she was worried. Paula asked her friend if she had never thought about why a woman brings her own maids after marriage. She stated that this was because some of the maids began to bully the new mistress of the house, or they refused to acknowledge her as the new mistress and did nothing. She said that to avoid this, the new mistress takes with her someone loyal to her. She also told her friend that there was no one else on her side except her faithful servant. Ari understood that they would soon get divorced, and she didn't need it. Paula asked her friend to look at it from the other side. She stated that in this estate, Audrey had no one to rely on except her. Ari was taken aback because she did not expect to hear anything like that. The young lady looked at her friend intently and asked if she understood what she was saying now. Her maid very rarely spoke when she was in trouble, Paula sighed and said that it was partly for her own well-being, but also for her own sake. So she had to understand the situation and be more careful in managing her staff. After some time, the young maid sighed heavily, lying on the ground. She was puzzled, as she did not find anything worthwhile. She understood that her mistress had clearly hidden the documents somewhere, but she could not find anything. But after a few seconds, she noticed the documents that were attached to the table. She happily rushed towards them, as she had finally found something interesting. She understood that her mistress was hiding something like this, and she probably didn't want anyone else to get to the documents. She assumed that she had found something worthwhile, so she immediately reached for the bundle of documents. But at that very moment, the young maid was taken aback and froze in place. She heard some noise outside the door. She turned around hastily and fixed her gaze on the door. She was in shock and did not understand why she was disturbed now, but she heard Audrey's voice asking if Rosalie was there. She was confused and said that she was there, but also asked what happened. Audrey told her so-called friend that she remembered how she had helped her with cleaning the outbuilding earlier, so she decided to help her. She asked Rosalie if she could open the door for her. Rosalie was taken aback and said that she had spilled water and would immediately wipe it all up and open the door. Audrey was taken aback and asked the young maid what she meant, since she was not supposed to bring any water with her. Rosalie was in shock and didn't know what to do. She was scared and understood that she would soon be exposed, but she also understood that the girl had been watching her all this time. Audrey said furiously that she had to open the door immediately or she would do it herself. Rosalie was very scared and did not know what to do in this situation, since she knew that the maid should not have been in the estate. At that moment, the young lady looked at her friend with a smile as she had finally found her. Audrey looked at the maid in bewilderment and asked what she wanted. Overjoyed, the young maid said with a smile that the head maid had been looking for her and wanted to know what would be best to cook for dinner. Audrey was furious, as she understood that this was all at the wrong time, but in turn she agreed and asked where the head maid was. Amy smiled and said that the head maid was in the kitchen now. Audrey said that she would go to her immediately. Rosalind was very glad that the girl had finally left. At the same time, she hurried with a joyful smile to steal the document that she had found earlier. But suddenly Emmy called her friend and asked if she was there. She said with a smile that she would help her with cleaning if she opened the door, since it would be dinner soon and they needed to hurry. The young maid was taken aback and froze in place, but still agreed. She was a little puzzled because she knew she had to pick up the documents, but at the same time she realized that she would have to change her plans. Meanwhile, the young lady happily strolled around the city, as she had not left the estate and tower for a long time. She looked at the busy streets with a joyful smile, as she often went out into the city in secret from her parents with her maid. And she thought for a moment, as she had never heard before, that her maid was not having a good time. She remembered how they happily walked around the city as children. At this point, she became gloomy as she realized that she had been too selfish. As she thought about it, she realized that her maid had separated from her friends, with whom she had been friends since early childhood. She understood that she had to go to her parents as soon as possible and get more maids, but at that very moment, as she was passing by the shop, she froze. She saw the beautiful necklace and thought of her faithful servant, as she knew that the gift would be perfect for her, since her favorite color is blue. At that moment, she was taken aback, as the lady asked with a smile whether she really wanted to buy this gift. Ari greeted Madame with a smile, as they had not seen each other for a long time. Madame smiled and stated that this was their first meeting since her wedding day. She asked with a joyful smile who the lady wanted to buy the necklace for, and suggested that it was a gift for her husband. At that very moment, the young lady was taken aback, as she realized that her husband would be puzzled by this gift, and the very thought made her feel sick. She stated with a smile that this was not the case and that she would like to buy a gift for her personal maid. The madam smiled and stated that the young lady could take another pendant for her husband. At that very moment, she said that the imperial topaz would suit him perfectly. Ari looked closely at the beautiful pendant, as it contained silver and yellow topaz, and it really reminded her of her husband. The madam said with a smile that gifts for newlyweds have special meaning. She said with burning eyes that he was sweet, like sparkling jewels whispering of eternity, and she had heard all about their passionate love. At that very moment, Madame said with a smile that they had made a bold statement about their wedding at the Crown Prince's ball, while she bombarded the young lady with questions, as she wanted to know who had been the first to confess their feelings. Ari froze in shock, because she had completely forgotten that Madame was one of those people who lived through love stories. The madam asked with a smile whether the Lord hid his soft side under his rough exterior. She said that he was most likely showing tenderness and care towards his wife, and at the same time showing his vulnerable side as a lone wolf. Aerie froze in shock, as she couldn't even imagine anything like this. At that very moment, Madame, with a playful smile, asked the girl if she was really that cheeky kitty who had seduced him. The young lady was shocked by such statements. She said that she thought she should buy a necklace and leave as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the young maid was slowly preparing wonderful sweets for her mistress, as she had previously said that she would come early, so Audrey wanted to meet her. She left the delicious treats in the kitchen and hurried away. But at that very moment, she turned around and looked at her new friend in bewilderment, as she was screaming with tears in her eyes that wherever she looked for the necklace, it was nowhere to be found. The maids rushed to their friend and asked if her precious necklace, which was given to her by her mother, was missing. Amy stated that she had taken it off and taken it to the room, and in the morning it was still lying in the room, but now it was gone. At that moment, Rosalind screamed and drew attention to herself. She stated that their friend's necklace was missing. She said that she would like to look at all the rooms. The young ladies looked at each other and agreed with her. Audrey glanced sideways at the maid, hoping that everything would end well. At that very moment, Rosalind looked at Audrey with a predatory grin and asked if she agreed with the search of the rooms. Audrey was taken aback and looked at the maid in bewilderment. She stated that, of course, she agreed, since there was nothing foreign in her room. But at that very moment, a strong chill ran down her spine as she saw the maid's grin and the intent glances of all the other maids. A moment later, the young maids began to search each room in turn. The young maid was filled with bitter tears as she treasured this gift from her mother very much. But moments later, Rosaline shouted very loudly that she had found the necklace and it was in Audrey's room. At that moment, everyone looked intently at the maid and their glances were by no means joyful. Audrey was shocked because she knew it was simply impossible, since she didn't even know where Emmy's room was, and simply couldn't steal it. Rosalie looked at the girl with a fierce grin and asked if she was really going to continue denying the facts. Rosalie stated that everyone knew perfectly well how arrogant she was, and yet she enjoyed the young lady's favor. Amy was furious, and at that very moment she attacked the young maid, as she did not understand how she dared to touch her mother's things. They shouted that even if she was the mistress's maid, this was unforgivable, and therefore they intended to report this incident to the head maid. Audrey was in shock and screamed for them to stop as it was really not her fault. She wanted them to listen to her side. But at that very moment, the young maid rushed at the jewel thief and shouted that she was disgusting, while she raised her hand, as if she intended to hit her. Meanwhile, the young lady was returning back to the estate. She still bought a necklace for her husband and for her maid. She knew that a gift for her husband was a waste of money. A moment later, she walked out into the estate and didn't notice anyone. The young lady was a little puzzled and did not understand why there was no one in the hall and no one greeted her. But at that very moment, the young maid ran out and shouted to the mistress that something terrible had happened. She looked at the maid in bewilderment and asked what had happened. The girl was breathing heavily and could not put a few words together, as she was shocked by everything that was happening. But moments later, she claimed that right then and there, the other maids were beating Audrey. After hearing this, the young lady hurried to her friend's aid. Upon entering the room, she was taken aback, as she saw that her friend was being beaten very harshly by other maids. She froze for a moment as she beheld a truly terrifying picture. At that moment, all the maids froze, and Audrey, in turn, looked at her mistress in a daze. She was very puzzled that the lady saw her in such a state. At that very moment, the young lady dropped the gift to her maid and looked with fury at everyone present. Burning with anger, she glared at everyone present and declared that she was giving them one last chance and that they must immediately tell her what had happened. For a moment, everyone froze in stupor and a dead silence fell over the room. Rosalind broke the silence and said that the girl was a thief, and she stole the necklace that Amy got as a keepsake from her mother. Amy, trembling with fear, told the lady that everything was exactly like that. Amy shouted that the necklace had been found in the thief's room, but Audrey shouted that she had not stolen anything. Amy was furious and shouted that they all saw that it was in her room, so she couldn't deny it. Audrey furiously asked the girl if she had been in her room and if she had seen everything that was happening with her own eyes. She was screaming that Rosalind had found the necklace. So Audrey wondered if she had been lying. At that very moment, the head maid approached the girls and asked what was going on. She was taken aback when she saw the lady as she had come early. Ariscilia, burning with anger and fury, declared that everyone should immediately shut their mouths. Ariscilia was furious as she understood that everything happened just as her friend had told her, but she remained icy calm. She slowly picked up a small box containing a necklace for her friend. Audrey froze in place for a moment, as did everyone else. Aerie slowly approached her maid and called her tenderly. She looked at the maid with a tender smile and opening the box said that on her way home she had seen a necklace that she thought would suit her perfectly. She asked with a smile if she liked the gift. Audrey froze for a moment as she was very happy, and at the same time she was touched by her mistress's concern. At that moment, the young lady glanced sideways at the maid and asked if she had really said that Audrey had stolen her necklace. Amy was taken aback, but at that moment she said that it was so. Aries stated that sometimes she would give her maid a necklace, earrings, and rings. Perhaps they were not as valuable as her mother's necklace, but they were still precious things. She looked closely at the maid and asked what the point was in stealing from her. Emmy was taken aback because she did not know what to answer. Rosalie was furious and did not understand why the lady had come, but now, since she had disrupted all her plans. At that moment, she couldn't stand it any longer and said that she was sorry to talk about such things. But the mistress's maid always perceived them as servants from another mansion, and because of this cookie, she decided to put them in an awkward position. Ari looked at the maid with fury and asked when she had given her the word. Ari stated that she was the owner of the mansion, and at the same time, she told the maid not to even think about breaking the rules and order with her lies. The young maid was shocked. She did not understand what was wrong with her mistress, because previously she did not care about the affairs inside the mansion. At that moment, the young lady turned her attention to the head maid and declared that she was disappointed with her. She wondered if he had been so cold in his treatment of their maids that something like this could happen. She angrily declared that she must immediately fire everyone who was involved in the violence. Everyone present was taken aback, as they did not expect such a thing, and at the same time they did not know what to do after being fired. Rosalie was in shock. She knew that she couldn't let things happen this way. She knew that if she could only get the documents out of the closet, everything would go in a different direction. At that very moment, the head maid shouted to the mistress that this simply could not be. She stated that they could not fire so many people because that was how she wanted it. The head maid said that she had to not only follow her orders, but also discuss them with the master. Ari looked intently at the maid but did not answer. The head maid said that she would do nothing without her master's order. At that very moment, the young gentleman entered the room and declared that he permitted this to be done, for the lady's orders were Vandermeer's orders. Everyone froze for a moment in shock, as they did not expect to see the young master in the house so early, and moreover, they were shocked that he gave his permission. He looked intently at his wife and declared that she could do as she wished. At that very moment, knights flew into the room. Damien declared to his knights that they must arrest the head maid and Rosalind. The knights hastily began to carry out his order, and they quickly overpowered the head maid. They also immediately grabbed Rosalind, but she screamed furiously that she had done nothing. Damien looked at the maid with fury and asked if she really thought he didn't know anything. He stated that he was well aware that she and the head maid had served in the Duke's household, and that they were in shock because they had been discovered. At this, the young lady froze in shock because she knew nothing. Damien turned to his assistant, who said with a smile that he had already prepared everything. A moment later, Colin handed his mistress some documents and asked her to look at them. She froze in place with slag as she began to read them. However, after reading it, she realized that the maid and the head maid were watching her. At the same time, they hatched a plan and wanted to get rid of their mistress and separate the young masters. The young lady was furious when she read that they had found her weakness. At that very moment, the young maid froze in place from shock and began to tremble. She screamed that it was all a lie and that she had never written those letters, but she understood that the evidence was irrefutable and no one would believe her. A moment later, the young maid declared that the letter given to her was written by her friend, and she received confirmation at the post office. Rosalind was in shock and realized that she was in a hopeless situation. She always thought she had acted carefully, and at the same time she hoped that no one had discovered her. But now she saw that the maid was not just a maid, but a sent spy. Marie reported that the girl went to the Duke's house every Tuesday to report on the current situation. And on Thursdays, she received the answers and instructions that arrived with the food, and on Colin's orders, she intercepted the letters and made copies, and sent them to the ducal house. Damien, looking at his wife, said that they were waiting to get irrefutable evidence, so they allowed this incident to happen, and he also asked his wife for forgiveness for not telling her earlier. The young lady, in turn, looked at her husband with a tender smile and said that she, on the contrary, was grateful to him for taking care of what she had missed. He was glad to hear something like this from her, and therefore asked her to leave the punishment of the maid and the head maid to him. She asked with a smile if that meant she could take care of the others. He smiled and said that she was free to do as she wished. But at that very moment, everyone present was taken aback and began to hastily beg for forgiveness. Damien told his subordinates to take the violators to the basement. The young maid was furious. She understood that this situation could not end like this. The knights were shocked. They shouted at her to shut up and not make a sound. But at that very moment, they froze in place as if rooted to the spot, as they saw her menacing and cruel look. The young lady was taken aback and turned around in a hurry as she heard a wild scream. The knights were shocked, but at the same time they were enveloped in a burning pain, as the maid burned them with magic and began to run away in a hurry. Damien was shocked that there was a maid with aura skills next to them, but a moment later he looked askance at his wife, as she furiously released all her magic and ordered no one to interfere. Turning around, he froze in shock as he saw what his wife was capable of. The young lady's expression quickly changed and she angrily announced that she would see to it that she was caught and given her due. The maid, running away, began to push everyone in her path. But the young lady, without wasting a minute, chased after the fleeing maid. Rosalie was in shock. She knew she had to get out of the estate as soon as possible. But unfortunately, she chose the wrong one as her opponent. And at the same time, the young sorceress used her magic with lightning speed. At that moment, the handmaid realized that she was enveloped in magic. She fell to the ground with a thud as she felt a searing pain spread throughout her body. And turning around, she saw that she was bound by the magic of the young sorceress, and she screamed with rage. Ariscilia looked menacingly at the maid and asked furiously where she was going. She looked at her victim with a predatory look and asked about the weak spot she had mentioned in the letter. The young maid, trembling with fear, began to scream that she was wrong and that she really had not seen anything. She begged for forgiveness and asked that her life be destroyed. Ariscilia, with a predatory grin, declared that she was not moved by the maid's pleas and requests. With the help of magic, she quickly closed the maid's mouth. At that moment, she looked predatorily at her victim and asked him how about moving to the basement. Later, the details of the incident came to light. The head maid, who had worked for the young lord for a long time, was seduced by the offer of the ducal house and helped Rosalind in her plan. It was confirmed that Rosalind was a mercenary sent specifically for this matter. In the end, all the maids who had fallen for Rosalind's provocation were fired without letters of recommendation, and their place was taken by servants from Hugo's estate. Sometime after the incident, the young lady slowly came to her husband. She asked him with a smile if he was okay, and without taking his eyes off his documents, he asked in what way. She sighed and said that it must be hard for him to feel betrayed and lost. Ariscilia asked him with bewilderment what was wrong with his face. He sighed heavily and stated that he had never thought that she had such a vulnerable side. She asked him with a smile if she didn't seem like a kind and compassionate person at first glance. He smiled and said that wasn't quite true. She was shocked and said that it looked like an insult. Damien sighed and said that he didn't really value the head maid and was already used to this kind of thing, so everything was fine. After his words, the young lady froze in shock, as she did not expect that he was used to this kind of thing. Damien looked at his wife and noticed that she really valued her maid. He asked if there was any special reason. She said with a smile that Audrey was the first person who recognized her true value. Aries stated that when she was little, no one understood her. At that moment, she remembered her childhood, because one day the teacher asked the children with a smile what they wanted to be when they grew up. Some said they wanted to become a knight, some said they wanted to become a princess, and the young lady in turn stated that she wanted to become the best magician in the world. She spoke with their burning eyes that she would be the strongest and most powerful, but everyone just looked at her with mockery because they understood that she was very strange and were not sure that she was capable of such a thing. At that very moment, her school friend declared that her mother had said that the most important thing for a woman was to get married, but Ari knew she wasn't interested in marriage at all. At the same time, she continued to happily tell her southerner that when she grows up, she will become the most powerful magician. She said that she would rule the world and she believed it sincerely. Audrey smiled and told her mistress that it was amazing. Ari was shocked, as no one had ever said anything like that before. Audrey said with a smile that she had a goal, and it was wonderful and amazing, and she said that she was sure that her mistress would become an extraordinary adult, and of course, become the most powerful sorceress. The young lady was very happy to hear this, and the maid's words gave her strength. She declared with a smile that she would become the most powerful wizard, and in the future, she would share the world with her friend. Ari said with a gentle smile that her maid was the only one who supported her dreams. After all, even her family did not support her, as Audrey did. And at the same time, she was very surprised and amazed that a stranger believed in her more than her family. That's why she tenderly stated that her personal maid was a very important person to her. At that very moment, the channel said with a smile that, in addition to the fact that they are simply a servant and mistress, having such a person next to them is a great luck. Damien sighed heavily and told his wife that she was right. At that very moment, the young lady with a smile announced that she had something for her husband. He accepted the small box but asked what she had given him. She smiled and said that she had bought a gift for her maid and for him. Damen looked at his wife with bewilderment and declared that men were forbidden to wear jewelry except for wedding rings. She was shocked and shouted that if he didn't like it, he could simply sell the gift. He was taken aback and shouted that this was not so, and he said this because he did not want the meaning of her gift to be lost. She said with a smile that it didn't matter whether he would use the gift or not. What mattered was that she had given him a wonderful gift. Ari, smiling, said that from that moment on, as she gave the gift to him, it was no longer hers, and now it was his thing, and he could do with it whatever he wanted. The young man froze for a moment, as he did not expect to hear anything like that. At that moment, he reached for the gift and pulled it out. Ari asked in bewilderment, "Didn't he say earlier that he wouldn't be able to wear it?" He put the beautiful pendant on his neck and said with a smile that he could do it for a short time. But at that very moment, he thanked his wife with a smile for the gift. She laughed wildly and said that of course he should thank her, because his gift had cost her dearly. He was surprised but did not answer, because he liked her reaction. But moments later, he asked if his wife was free this weekend. He looked at his wife with embarrassment and asked her to go on a date. Ari froze for a moment and was filled with embarrassment. She did not expect anything like this from him at all. She stared at her husband for a moment as he suddenly asked her out on a date. Taking advantage of the cheerful atmosphere, the young man asked her out on a date. She was silent for a long time and did not know what to answer him. But a moment later, an epiphany came to her, and her face quickly changed. She did not understand what had happened and why. Taken aback, she asked if the actor's work had clouded his mind. She screamed that, taking advantage of the cheerful atmosphere, he asked her out on a date. He was shocked and screamed that he was offering it out of necessity. Damen sheepishly stated that his family had ordered the maid to separate them. He said that they were planning to divorce them before they found the will in order to turn the situation in their favor. And as it turned out, the maid had informed them in detail that they were not particularly close, and their enemies could take advantage of this to achieve their divorce. And she looked at him intently and with a smile noted that this was just an idea, which was to show others that they were very close. He said with a smile that she finally understood him. At the same moment, she shouted that she was not delighted with everything, but she would gladly accept his offer of a date. He sighed heavily and said that he was so touched now that it seemed like he would lose consciousness. At that very moment, Ari jumped off the table and said with a smile that it was time for her to meet on the weekend. But the young man asked her to wait a few more minutes, as he had something for her. The young lady was taken aback when she saw a whole mountain of documents. He stated that these were meeting options that his assistant had prepared, and there were many restaurants, entertainment venues, and places for walks listed there. Damen said that the papers contained information about the estimated time for each event, so she should study everything. And he also asked the chef about what dishes she liked. The young lady froze in shock. At that moment, she became thoughtful, because she knew that their chef was an excellent cook of meat, and thinking about it, her mouth began to water. Damen, looking at his wife, asked if she was listening to him at all. A few days later, the young maids looked at their master with surprise and confusion. They were shocked and said that their master was elegant. A moment later, the young man turned his gaze to his wife, as she called him. Standing at a distance, he said with a smile that today she was as beautiful as ever. Ari didn't answer him, but she was very happy with such words. A moment later, she said with a smile that of course it was so, and he was also beautiful today. At that very moment, the maids declared with smiles that their mistress was incredibly beautiful. She accepted their compliments with a smile. Damen briefly considered whether he should show the workers at Hugo's estate that he and his wife had been intimate. But without looking at his wife, he said that it was time for them to go. The young lady extended her hand to him with a satisfied smile, but the young man did not expect this and immediately shuddered. He looked away from his wife in bewilderment and didn't even intend to offer her his hand in return. In a hurry, he shouted that he couldn't wait, so they had to hurry. The young lady was shocked by such an attitude towards her, and at the same time, the maids looked at the master with their mouths open. For a moment, the young lady looked after him with bewilderment. She was puzzled that he did not take her hand. After some time, the young couple went to a restaurant. Damen, in turn, courted his wife elegantly, and she responded with a beautiful smile. But at that very moment, she said that earlier he had not even accompanied her, and now he was demonstrating gallant manners in front of everyone. He sighed and embarrassedly said that he had not slept enough, so he asked for forgiveness. She shouted that it was because he slept anywhere but in bed. But a moment later, the young people were taken aback and turned around as they heard a familiar voice. Ari looked at the crown prince with bewilderment, as she did not expect to see him in such a place. Frederick greeted his girlfriend with a smile and stated that this was their first meeting since her wedding. Damien, without wasting a moment, demonstrated his elegant manners and greeted the crown prince. Frederick, in turn, with a smile, told the young man to calm down and sit down already. At that very moment, he sat down next to his girlfriend and congratulated the young knight on his marriage. And he also stated that choosing someone like his girlfriend as a wife was truly a great success. Ari looked at her friend with bewilderment, as she did not understand why he sat next to her. Damien was also surprised by the prince's actions, but sitting down opposite his wife, he said that he agreed with the prince. The prince looked at the young knight with a predatory grin and asked if this was true. At the same moment, he said with a predatory grin that he really hoped that luck would be with them for a long time. The young knight froze for a moment, as he did not expect such a thing. After some time, they were having a cheerful conversation, and the prince asked his friend if she remembered their first meeting. She smiled and said that she remembered the day when he got lost at the entrance ceremony and asked for directions. He smiled and said that he thought she was a high school student because she was so calm. Damien was not at all calm, as he had already been listening for half an hour to something he did not understand. He felt extremely uncomfortable because the young people were having a lively conversation, and at the same time he understood that it was he and his wife who should be talking like that. Ari was taken aback and asked for forgiveness, as she thought that her husband was very bored, since he did not know this story, and she also noticed that they had been talking for too long. At that very moment, the young man slammed his glass down on the table and declared that everything was fine, because he enjoyed watching his inspired wife. The young lady was shocked by this, and the prince was very angry. Frederick grinned and told the young man that if he didn't understand his wife's words, he should apologize instead of trying to get out of it by saying a couple of compliments. Damien smiled and said that he was charmed by his wife, because they were still on their honeymoon and he had unknowingly made a mistake. At that very moment, the girl was taken aback as she realized that she had accidentally served non-alcoholic wine. Damien said with a smile that his wife was an incredible beauty, so he would be enchanted and in love with her all his life. He asked his wife with a smile if she would forgive him for this. The young lady laughed wildly as she noticed that her husband was always very nice. Damien looked at his wife with a satisfied smile of victory, and at the same time he saw how the prince burned him with his eyes of rage. Frederick presented his girlfriend with shrimps with a smile, as he knew she loved them very much. He said with a smile that after graduating from the academy, his girlfriend's favorite seafood became shrimp and lobster. He looked at the young man closely and declared that he must remember something like this very well. Damien looked at the prince with fury, as he was worried that he knew his wife well. Meanwhile, the young lady was drooling over the beautiful shrimp. Damien understood perfectly well that this was a clear provocation on the part of the prince. But at that very moment, the young lady called out to her friend in a menacing tone. She said that she thought he was behaving this way because he wanted to ask her for something. But to apologize, she said that she did not take bribes. She declared that she was a real magician who would soon become the head of the magic tower. A moment later, when she asked the waiter for another serving of shrimp, Federico moved on and stated that he had simply said that she liked shrimp. She was shocked and screamed that she was very disappointed. At that very moment, she shouted that she preferred meat and asked if he had forgotten about it. Aries said she prefers a juicy, medium-rare steak that spills like the Red Sea when you cut into it. A meat with a rich aroma and a distinct fatty flavor. She continued to scream, and the crown prince continued to calm her down. But in the meantime, her husband, without wasting a minute, asked the waiter to cancel the previous order and bring the fillet with an extra portion of shrimp. The young lady praised her husband with a smile. He smiled and stated that he was well aware of his wife's tastes. She was glad to hear this, but at the same time, the prince looked at them sideways with fury. After some time, the prince smiled and told his friend that he really hoped she would have a good time during the rest of her time. She smiled and wished him a good journey. Frederick said with a grin that it was a pleasure to spend time with them. Damien said with a sigh that it was a great honor for him. A moment later, the prince extended his hand to his girlfriend. She asked in surprise what else he wanted, but he said that she should give him her hand for a farewell kiss. The young lady, in turn, looked menacingly at the crown prince. At that very moment, she came closer to him and said menacingly that he was acting very strange today. She asked if he really wanted to tell her something. At this, the crown prince turned his gaze to her husband, who was also very angry about this. The prince moved closer to his friend with a grin and stated that the truth was that he had been wanting to tell her something for a long time. He looked at her with a gentle smile and asked if she would listen to him. At that very moment, the young lady showed him her ring and announced her expectation, while the prince froze, looking at her with bewilderment. She sighed heavily and asked if she hadn't explained to him that it was a bad habit. She said that if he had something to say, he should say it immediately and put an end to it. She didn't want him to bother his head because she was already a busy person. The prince was shocked by his girlfriend's words, but at that very moment, he burst into wild laughter. He said with a smile that next time he and Paula would come to meet her, Aries smiled and happily said that she would look forward to them, because they had not met since the wedding. She smiled and said that when she was having lunch with her friend the last time they talked about him, he was pleased with what he heard and, smiling, looking at her husband, said that they should meet soon. As he left, he said goodbye to his girlfriend and said that he would write to her. The young lady said goodbye to the prince with a joyful smile. Meanwhile, her husband was looking gloomily into the distance. Aries smiled, looking at her husband, and said that now they could move on to the next place. After some time, the young people moved to a beautiful park, and the young lady noted with a smile that she had been given a good place, and the atmosphere was simply wonderful. But after a moment, her mood vanished, as her husband stated that he was saying this in advance, but he was not going to pretend that he was jealous of her or anything like that. She asked in bewilderment why he was saying such nonsense. He sighed and said he was simply telling her not to put him in a situation like today. She asked in surprise with a smile on her face, did he really not trust the crown prince? Damen stated that he was his wife's friend, but he was still a man. She said with a smile that I had often heard something like this at the academy, but she always said that a man and a woman could be ideal friends. At that very moment, she asked her husband if he knew who the most unattractive man in the world was. She changed her expression and declared that it was the one who was jealous and was interfering with female friendship. He sighed heavily and turned around, declaring that since they were married, she should behave carefully and appropriately. The young lady of opium walked by and declared that he should take care of himself. A moment later, she said that he had previously told her that they should let everyone know that they were dating, but he had not even taken her hand and had treated her like a stranger. Immediately after a minute, her ice extended her hand to her husband. At this, the young knight froze in place in a daze when he saw her hand. She looked at him with fury and said that if he continued to behave like this, she would get angry too. She stated that he should behave well during the boat ride. After some time, the young people moved into the boat, and looking at her husband, she asked him to freeze. Aries slowly reached out to her husband. At this, he froze in place, rooted to the spot, and was filled with embarrassment. Damen looked around and saw that the other lovers were tenderly showing their feelings, and at the same time kissing without a hint of embarrassment in front of everyone. He froze in embarrassment and wondered if this was what she wanted. He raised the issue that this was already too much on her part, and at that very moment he dodged her and fell into the boat with a crash. He turned around and stood frozen in a daze. Since he saw his wife wet from head to toe, and at the same time she was as furious as a predatory bear, Damen hastily asked his wife to calm down. She was furious and screamed that if he were in her place, he would not be calm. Damen knew he had made a huge mistake and needed to apologize quickly, but he was puzzled as she approached him without saying anything. Aries screamed furiously that he had a petal in his hair and she just wanted to take it off. She didn't understand why he acted like that, but she screamed that she didn't mean to rip his head off or anything like that. Damen was shocked and asked her for forgiveness. After some time, the young people slowly returned back to the estate. Damen, in turn, continued to ask his wife for forgiveness, since he did this unintentionally, as he was very surprised at that moment. She sighed heavily and asked menacingly if he really thought that she was trying to make physical contact with him, and that was why he wanted to avoid that. He looked away as he could not answer anything. She was angry because he didn't answer her, but at the same time she asked if he knew how offensive his attitude towards her was. She screamed that she also didn't like physical contact with other people, and he wasn't the only one who was bothered by it. She didn't understand why he didn't think about other people's feelings. Damen froze in place, stupefied, and turned very pale. Aries asked angrily if she was disgusting. She didn't understand why he was trying to reject her. The young man timidly said that it wasn't so. He was scared and wondered what if she would give him as her head maid, and at the same time he wondered what if she would treat him as his own. Damen couldn't answer her question. She sighed heavily and asked why he wasn't answering. At that moment, a shudder ran through him, and he quietly asked how he could trust her and tell her everything. She was shocked by this, and asked why he married her if he didn't trust her. He sighed heavily and, sweating profusely, declared that this marriage had been entered into for mutual benefit. She sighed heavily and asked if he really thought that justified hurting another person. He looked at his wife in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. Ari looked menacingly at her husband and declared that she would be honest with him, because his attitude towards her had insulted and hurt her. She didn't want to talk to him anymore, so she asked the coachman to stop the carriage. She declared that she didn't want to be near him anymore. Damen was taken aback and shouted to his wife that he would try to improve and would practice. She looked at him puzzled and stated that they were on the same side and they should stay married until he inherited the title. She screamed that this was the reason she thought she needed to know why he was avoiding physical contact, but he rejected her, knowing he couldn't trust her. At that very moment, she looked at him menacingly and furiously and declared that he must do as she said. A moment later, the young lady quickly stepped out of the carriage. The young man was confused and did not know how to fix the situation. At the same time, the young lady was very upset and did not want to talk to him anymore. He sighed heavily and wondered what he had done with his wife. After some time, the young man went to the Red Falcon Knights training ground, and there he vented his anger. The vice captain approached his commander and asked if he had had a fight with his wife. Damen was shocked and did not understand how his comrade knew something like this. But the vice captain asked how he could not understand something like this. After all, his captain destroyed the whole plan, crushing everything in his path. Looking at the captain, he asked him to tell him everything, since he was an expert in relationships and could help him. Damen sighed and said that he did not know which of the two reasons to start with. The young man was shocked, as there were many reasons. Damen sighed and said that her husband was bothered by the fact that he avoided physical contact with her, and she was also bothered by the fact that he told her that he did not trust her. The vice captain sighed heavily and told the captain that he thought she was worried that both of these problems were in him. He stated that these issues were offensive from his wife's point of view, and that he would cry from resentment and sadness. Damen said that his wife was not a crybaby like him, and she would rather get angry and quarrel with him in response. The vice captain told his captain that he was always busy and left his wife alone. And then on the first date after a long time, he made her feel bad. The young captain was taken aback as he remembered their first date. And now he realized the fact that he was the husband who offended his wife on the very first date. He sighed heavily as he realized that he truly was the worst of the worst spouses. Meanwhile, the young lady, without wasting a minute, came to the club where all the aristocracy gathered. The young ladies looked at the young sorceress in surprise, as it was the first time they had seen her in such a place. At the same time, the young people looked at the young sorceress with mockery, since she was alone without her husband. Audrey, without wasting a minute, ordered tea with apple and cinnamon. She was very angry and thought about her husband all the time, but she didn't want to make any concessions to him and wanted to do what she really liked. At the same time, the young people were happily chatting with each other and wondering if those who came to the club really just wanted to have fun. They mocked the young lady, saying that whether she was married or not, she always remained strange. They said that she could not become the head of the magic tower, and therefore quickly jumped into marriage, taking advantage of the situation. They also said that inside the magic tower, everyone believed that she would soon retire. But moments later, they greeted her with the same mockery as she approached them. Audrey quickly approached the young people and looked at them with fury. The young man mockingly asked if his words had really touched her, and without wasting a minute, she took the bottle of wine. The young man continued to mock the young sorceress and said that she had nothing but a pretty face. But at that very moment, Damen came to the rescue of his wife and, grabbing the young man by the hand, asked why he thought that a beautiful face was bad, because he believed that it was a gift from God. Damen angrily declared that he was the one who had sold himself to a high price, so the young man should watch his language. At that moment, he looked away and, looking at his wife, asked for forgiveness for being late. Damen looked intently at his wife and stated that if she wanted to say something, she could say it. Audrey froze for a moment as if rooted to the spot, as she saw the state her husband was in. She knew that he was always neat and impeccable, but now she realized that he was in a great hurry to see her and came in such a state. A moment later, she calmed down and stated that she had nothing to say. The young lady slammed the bottle of wine back down on the table and declared that they were all a world away from her. She came up and looked menacingly at the young man and declared that there was nothing to brag about, and that it was even very funny. A few seconds later, she called her husband and said that it was time for them to leave. Meanwhile, the young people looked after them with surprise and smiles, as they understood that people with similar temperaments get along well with each other. After some time, the young people wandered around the city. Audrey looked away from her husband's response and asked how he knew she had been to a place like that. He sighed heavily and stated that this was the place they had planned to go on their first date. The young lady turned around and stated that he was a little late. He sighed and said with bitterness in his voice that he had said too much that morning. At the same moment, he took off his jacket and, with his shirt swollen, wandered towards the overflow, as he intended to jump off the water. The young lady was shocked by this. She did not understand what he was doing at all. She was screaming that he seemed to be completely stupid. And at the same time, she said that she was not a child to be calmed by such things. He asked if he didn't have to jump in the lake and do everything else. She was in shock and screamed that he didn't have to do that. After some time, the young people stood quietly and stared at the serene lake. He sighed heavily and asked if his wife really liked to make fun of people. Ari said with a smile that she really liked to do that. At the same time, the young man looked intently at his wife as he saw her beautiful smile. He was very glad that she smiled because it brought him pleasure. But at that very moment, he broke their serene silence and said that she had said earlier that she had been called strange as a child. Ari looked at him in bewilderment and said that it was true. He sighed heavily and said with sadness in his voice that they called him crazy. The young lady was taken aback as she had not expected such a thing at all. She asked in surprise what he was saying. Damien sighed and, looking at his reflection, said that there was one reason why he carefully avoided physical contact. For a moment, he froze and was transported back to his terrible childhood. He remembered the day when he saw the faces, a very sad picture. He remembered seeing his mother sprawled on the cold floor, because that was the day he found his mother dead.